Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam shlo sani isha. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam pokeach ivrim. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam malbish harumim. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam atir asurim. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam zakef kilfim. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam roka haaretz al hamoyim. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam hamichim mitzadei gaver. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam mozer Yisrael b'gvura. Ruchatu Adinoi Eloheinu melech olam anosein la yoev koach. Ruchatu Adinoi melech olam hamshen miyah. Eloheinu davikem yalkim yadro dichev rever boludon zamim l'chesha bar Yitzra. Achikeinu me'adamro mechavero davikem Yitzra ma'asidrim chosmen shvelach. Usnei ayom uchol yom l'cheinu l'chesed l'rachamim b'yanecha b'nei chol roinu. Sigmalenu chasadim tovim Ruchatu Adonai Gomeu chasadim tovim li'amo Yisrael. Eino yom, chol yom. Olam yeh yishma mitzvah v'golov yom enu mezil shem yomar. V'bon kol holmi lo tzid machal machal yom v'chamar v'yaman nachla machal yenu ment matzid hosenu matzid kenu ma'yishusenu ma'gogenu ma'gavuraseinu. Man mal bin kharan wa sein wa lo kol gabain gain bin khajulu yom khim gib dar bon gib la roma sem tov mi khayem mehbel lifanakha musar adam mel behem oy kador ana nakhl khabir bisar bil habar kham wa shuz ma to lo ba maria sari yischach Nachle ga je weer door ze begen kadis ze zei shabach of dat smach als maar toch gaan Ashreinu shanachnu mashkimim maribim erev bavoker yom pamayim bechol yom Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai echad Atohu shalom 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 nazata ba'alkam shimcha ma'kudish mer shimcha mer ובשבועך טובים ושגבי הקרננו ברכתו אדוני בקדש שמך בו רבים מתונים בשמיים ובשמיים שמיים רב ראשון רב בדרך מעל דרך אני חושב שמהביאה בכאן פה סור רצה כי ביאת כל בעולם כי אתה הוא לבד כל מעשות זה שמיים בסור סיים מסכל שבם מי בכל מעשי ידיך אבל גם זכת שומע לך מה תעשה ובשמיים מעשי מנחס ובשמך גדול שנקרא להם קיים לנו ראה מה שכתוב وإصحاب يبسم بكبس أبسم كيتم سامسي بخلم يمشي خلنا راي أبي شمال مير بشلوش اسم ميدوزة دور ميدروش كم بخون يبسم أشوف بيرابي قبل خمسين بخلاف يوتم تونتون شوش خدار قالوا شيء بخلاف يوتم تونتون أخير شو خدار قالوا شيء بخلاف يوتم تونتون خدار شيء أتوا يخل خدار دوا خدار هيرو سمع فينا قال له لو سينو شيء بنا بيس ميكداش مهربي مينو بسين خال كينو بسورة سخا بشمنا بوت خبيرا كما الله مشانيم كاد مونيوس page 55 كادش ربانان بسكادال بسكاداش مربا بیالمادی براکی روسی بیام نخماقوسی خیلی خانو بیام خانو بخیلی خال بیس اسرائیل فقالا و بزمان کاری بیم رومی یهیش میربام براخی علم برمی علم یا سپوراخ بیشتباخ بیسپوار بیسرومام بیسناسی بیسهدار بیساله بیسالال شمیری گودیشه بریخو دیه لا میکو بخصا و شیراسا بیش بخصا و نخماسا تنبیران بیالما بیم رومی Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidei Hon v'al Kol Tamidei Samidei Hon v'al Komandios Kim B'Yoraisa di B'Asar Hadei v'di B'chol Asar v'Asar v'hi lehon ulechon Shlam Rabba China v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin adichin u'bezonei ribichei u'forkana min kodam avahon di v'shmaya v'yara v'yimru amein v'yehei Shlam Rabba min shmaya v'chayim tovim leinu v'al Kol Yisrael v'yimru amein Shalom Baramav, Uberacham of Yas, Shalom Aleinu, Yaka Yisrael, Yemru, Amen. Mizmoshir, Chanukah, Sabah, Yishu David, Bimchadik to San Matam Ali, Shvat Rabbi, Penaz, Rizim, Shamkhay Samra, and Kyoto, Behind Hati Bishalvi, Palmosh, לך גורם זה מעבר בלתי אשר עשיות לך ודושמע זה יפחת מספלי ותחתי סגדו למען יזמרך חבו ולא ידום אדוני אלוהי ולמודך מונס קדש יסגדל ויסקדש מרבו ויעמוד יברוק ירוסי וימליך מלכוסי בחיי יכונו ביום יכונו בחיי לכל בית ישראל הגולה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן יהי שמי רבו מבורך יעולם ולמי עולמיה ספורach וישתבח ויספואר ויסרומם ויסנעשי ויסדר ויסעלה ויסעלול שמי קדושה בריחו ויהי לה מכל ברכסה ושירסה תשבחסה ונחמסה שלומי רבי עמה ואמרו אמן יהי שלמה רב משמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן עושה שלום ברומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן 57 Baruch Shomar Yeholam Ruchu Ruchu Severishu Ruchu maybe it's Ruchim What? Yichir mi melech mishuba poadei shma gadol v'rgato Adonai melech mulal batish b'chos hoder and here is no Zaman osicho Rolam Talmud says so smach the b'yot v'shivah Al tigu b'mashicha yevin v'yayal tzarayu shalom koros b'chazor b'yamshav so sabur b'gemes choda v'chol sabur gadol Adonai m'olam yamim v'chol hei alim emridim v'Adonai shemayim v'sa hod v'chol gam gam hod min Mourning Vishtachavul Damra Gogoshu, Roma Mourning Vishtachavul Har Kocho, Ki Kodosh, Adonai Eloheinu, Yehuda Chapir Vomro Yashis, Yibolosha Porgat, Adonai Saracham Meni, Chastacha Bamitacha, Tmiditsuni, Schorachamecha, Tu Almiad Yosef Yosef, Shamnon, Shalom, Shalom, Sofia. Say shovel from Gal Marshal Ras was Sabsan Ras Kabla Yosal Ras was Shedebach. Adonai Yoshia, Hamelach Yaneinu, Biam Koreinu, Shisamecha, she will have himself. So now she's going to give voice Machli Ben, give a shank of Tachnu, Yichastacha, the Kashi, Halula, Arena Nechasabi Shakati, and London Commissar Gamasa, Nokia Drelega Malchom, as Mr. Tapia, Amalehu, Ashram to Holoshram. Pani bechastecha betach, tiegel libi bishuasecha, ashira ladinai ki gamalula, mizvah sodor in the oros. And that's in all of one to him. Who was son of Lomachno, some Ito badinoi yolam chasdov yador vador emunaso yi chevor adinoi yolam. Smach adir masa shemad minat haber zach shemesh amabor ramach goyim. Urachum Mirapirabon below Yashris, Vihi Boloshiva Poli, the Kolkamaso, Adonai Yoshia, Hamelach Yanenu, Biom Korenu, Ashrei Shebevi Secha, Jaldu Chosashin, Hello, Ashayam Tabir Mechanabal, Hashim Khalachal Yom Avor Heka, Lashim Khalid, Adonai Khaldoshba, Gidu, Takabora de Havdi Brain of Rosa, Sicha, Vezum Sari Meru, Rosa Sabaris, Yabi, Cisco, and Handur, Madura, Campaign, Woodall, Hospital. Mero, was the Yehuda, the Mosul Malchus, Moskalmin, Shaltoha, Beholder, but or Smay had another one of them in Nicolaka, the Psiach, ומשביע לכל חפצם, צדיק אדוני בכל דרכיו, חסיד בכל מעשיו, קרוב אדוני לכל קרוב, וכל שקרו, באמצעון ורבי יסף שמם יושם, שמי. תהילה עשה אדוני ידבר פיו ורי כל בשר שאין קודשו לעולם ואנחנו נבורכיו מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה, 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 נפשי יסע אדוני, אלוהים חיי יסע מלכי בידי, אל תתכבד במתנתי שתו יום הדו ואשר יום יסרו. סרבנו לבוא זה שמיים ורוסי יום יסגל שבן האוס. Som Yalma Devris. Yimlo Hadunoi Diolam. Elohai Sionador Vodover, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Kito, Samra Eloheinu. Hinoim Navasil Ben Jerusalem Adonai, Israel Chabe, Israel Mesbah. Golden Magid Bor Yaakov, who go mishpatab Yisrael, lo sochen lechol goyim mishpatim bal yadom, hallelujah, 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 Shemayim, Rubam Romim, Lukam, Lushme Shemayim, Mayim Shemel Shemayim, Hashman, you see Barbary Brother Milan, Koch Sample of Halus, and I mean, no, tiny to always a short shell, Quito, Ruach, Henry Carlos, a brief of Hema. Rams is super Malchel and Holim, also Bachon Gamsis, and Rim Halusham, like in discussion about how to allow Shemaim. Yorm Karunia, Motilo, Hol, Hasidov, Ibn Israel, Amkrobo, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Shiladoi, Shir Hadosh, so we call Hasidim is Machis, so we also make it. Lusham of Mahop, so we can also run you, etc. Lasos behemish podkasuv, hodahulol chasidov, hallelujah, 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 bekacho. Little bit of a little bit of a little second shop, little bit name, holding the law, possession of this as well. Kol haneshama, hallelujah, hallelujah, kol haneshama, hallelujah, hallelujah, baruch adonai, yolam mevi amen. Baruch adonai mitzvah, shkein mishlam, baruch adonai mevi karvalo. Ubaruch shem kivodo liolam. B'malei chavodo es kol haaretz, amen v'amen. Vayavarech David, es Adonai kol kol yom David. Bruchat Zwadin Elohei Shalom Elam, Chol Hagedula v'Hagevura v'Tiferet, Handicha Bashmar v'Chal Malcham Znasei v'Ashur Sher Kavod Yechot Hashem Yod Kavod Chaz Edako. V'Atonim Modim Anachnu Lacham L'Shem Techa Tuhu Techa Tuhu Asis Ases Shemai Shmei Shmai B'Al Zom Oretz Chol Asher Yamim Chol Asher B'Hem Tom Achayes Kulam V'So Shmei Chom Shlachavim Adohu V'Adonrim שבחרת בי אברהם ציסו מרכזים שמת לשם אברהם צוסס לבבו נמות בנך וחברוס עמו הבריס את כנעני אחיתי אמר בי הפיס ובאתו רבסלגתו ותירוס ובזה מסיים גזת כוסס שמעתי ימסו ודין אוסס מוסים פעם בחרבסו כי ידעתי ושאין תחש להם זה ויום בקעת לפניהם ויעברו בסוך היום ויבשה וישרו לפהם משלחת ומסולוס כמו אבן במים עזים ויושע אדוני ביום ההוא אשר מסביע ישראל מצרים מסביע ישראל הסיוע לגדול אשר עשו במצרים ויראום אס אדוני ויאמינו באדוני ובמשה עבדו אז שמשה בני ישראל שיר עזו אשור לאדוני כי גלגל סוס ברחוב רמם אז יבא זמרס יעדי ושוש אדוני בגלל יאבי ורום אמן הוא אדוני שמח משמר חבר וכן יאמר ימינך אדוני ידע בכורך אם ארץ ברס ויבר בגוינך תעזור שעשור ברמן נצא וכמוני דוב עשיר על שעות הרביחה בקדושי דברך מי כמוך ואלה מנוי מי כמוך נדו בקודש אשר סבריתי כמינך בחזרת לאות ועל כל מילים בחזיות שלו אלה מוב יחזר ושאותי מרס ובדו בעזרך עד יעבור מחל דנוי עד יעבור עמזו כניסה תיבאים שדעים המחלוץ ומחל שתחבלת ולא בקדוש אדוני כנגלה אדוני מלך רבי אדוני מלך רבי אדוני כי לאדוני המלוכה מושל בגויים ביולו מושיעים בהר ציון לשפורס הרי סב ויסל אדוני המלוכה והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד ישתבח שמך ועד מלכנו המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ילכון אלו אלו עושים שיש לך זרוע, שון נצח גדול וגורע, יוצא קדושו נחוס. ברכוס ודוס מעתה ביד עולם ברכתו אדינוי, אל מלך גדול בתיש בחוס, אל הדוס אדון נפלוס, הבוחר בשירי זמרה, מלך אל חי העולמים. יסקדל ויסקדש שמי רבה, ילמוד יברוך ירוסי וימליך מלכוסי, חייכון ויומייכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגולה בזמן קורי ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבו מבורך, כי עולם רמי עולם היה, יספורח וישתבח ויספואר ויסרומם ויסנסי, ויסהדר ויסעלה ויסעלול, שמי לקדושה בריחו, יהי לה מכל בחסה ושירסה, ששבחסה ונחמסה, דם ירום ביעלמה ויאמרו אמן. ברכו את אדוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד, ברכתו אל מלך העולם, יוצא אור ובורח חושך, עושה שלום ובורא את הכל, אמן לארץ. נדבר לכם חיות וידמס, יברש מרבו, סלם לכל ברכה מסיסה, מול הארץ כן יעמלך ואמרם חלפדם ושבח ובחום בסך שלום, ולא נברכה מרב מרחם אדון וזנצו בסקבינו, מגיעים שנצקה בדינו, לברכות ובהיכם ורצור לכם לעשות דהנה מהשמח, יוסס הציבור סגידה ורצקו הקדושים ורשעת האתו אמים, אינו אשר במסירתם יום לאור, שיסברו חמסה וצמרם מלכנו, ובשבח שמחלכנו מייצם שיבצם שבסב כל העובדים, ברום עולם השביח בכל דברים חיים אלוהם, כולם מחבים, כולם ברורים, כולם כפורים, כולם עושים בימה וירצון כולם. וכולם פוסחים עץ ביהם בקדושה ובתורה, בשירה ובזמרה, ומבורכים משבחים פוערים, ומעריצים ומקדישים וממליכים, שם אל המלך הגדול והקדוש, להקדיש ליוצרם בנחס רוח, בשפה ורוע ובנימה, קדושה כולם כאחד, עונים ויאמרים ביראה, קדוש, 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 והאופנים בחיוס הקודש, ברעש גדול מסנסים למסרפים, למסם משבחים ויאמרים, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו, לברכוס אל מלכה וקיים, למשל בשל בעדו הפועל, פרסוס אל חודש מעל מחברי צדו, מצביח השוער ובונה דרוס דרוס. המחדש בברויות וידמס יברך כאמור, לא שערים גדולים גדולים רסו. אור חדש על ציון תואר, ונזכה כולנו מהרות יורו, ברכתו אדוני, יוצר המאורות. הקרבותינו חבדו של המחדבים מלכנו, ואהבו של חברה, ותלודים כול כן, גן תחתינו ברחם הרחם רחם עלינו, שים בליבנו, לא בינס גשמון, אמן. ואבינו לשלום, מארבע כנפות הארץ, ולכן כל מסעשינו כי יבוא ישועתך. ובוא נבחרת מכל עם ולשון, וקרבתנו לשמך קדוש על במס, להודות לך ולייחדך באהבה, ברכתו אדוני, הבוחר בעמו ישראל באהבה, שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. אדוני אלוהיכם, ולא בכל אבכם כל ממשיכם סעתים ותארץ גם בעיתו, יורה עמל קוש ויסעתו דיונך, ומסירו של ביצורך בנסעתי יסע וסעותך, ביכולתו בזאת השחרור לכם, הן יפתה לבבכם, וסעתם ובנתם עמכם, ושלכם בסמלם, וחורף אדוני ברכם, ויוצר אס השמיים, ולא יהיה מותר, ויהו אדם ועשיתין אסיבולה, ותמר, ואמר עשית אבו אשר אמר נושא אתכם, ושמתם מסתבור רעילה, על בכם יום נפשכם לכם, ואויר את אותו בניכם, ולימדתם ועושם, אס בניכם ויבושיבתך, ויסך הלכתך בדרך, ובשכבך, ובכמסחתנו, ובשך בשרה. למען ירבו ימיכם בימי בניכם, על אדומה שישבהד ולבסיכם, וסייסם תמי השמיים, ולעשו יום לדרויים, ושל אמור, רבי בני ישראל מעטו עליהם סולם. ציזיס אל country, וגידים לרוסון העציס שכנף, פסיעות חזו, וכם לציציס, ושם עשו זכתם, סכם עשו עשנו, וסיסם עשם, ולעשו סובו, אחרי לבבכם וחמיכם, אשר אתם זלים אחרים, למען ציזיס כבתם כמסוסוי, ישם קדושים אלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר רוצה שיעשכם, ויש מסר יוסכם אלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אמס. אדוני אלוהיכם, אמס. תקציב נכון. עדיף שגם בקרוב וטוב יפה הדוב עושים לא בלי למס ולא יאמר דור ודור קיים ושמו קיים בחיסון נכון ומחוסו באמונתו עד קיימס קיים עד all of sin v'la ben rosenu v'al kol doros Yisrael avodecha mal shani b'acharonim tov tov kazam b'yamem v'chol Yotzerenu tzusha seinu podenu masilenu yala shemecha ein Elohim zulasecha es raso v'seinu tem yalam das Arav selo sheshma zeh v'soros chalibo emzot on b'chol emzot on shul Torah وإنما يخمزها خمها رزاق شبخو نوبر مميم نفسي دي سيراس بخوص برخوض اسمه خالد بن عمرو يسقط الرا معش بالقيم بياش بالموس ياسي خود بيوس عمل شبخ تيغوزل اليوم برخم برخ موشى ابن إسرائيل خان وشيرا بسمخا ربا بيامرو خلام ميخمخو بولي مدناي ميخمخ خدد وكودش نورش شيرا خداشا شبخو گولم سمخاس أسباس أيام يأخذ كلام خدو ويمليخو ويامرو أدوناي يملخ يلام بوس ويسرائيل كما بيسرع إسرائيل وديخنو مخنو بيسرائيل قالين وأدوناي سباش ما قدرش إسرائيل وخطو أدوناي قوال إسرائيل Baruch Ato Adonai. Eloheinu v'Elokei Avosenu le'Avraham le'Yitzchak v'le'Yaakov Ha'il hagadol ha'gibor b'han ro'er elyon Gomil chasidim tovi v'kan Yaakov v'zocher chasdei avos ומביא גואל לבני בניהם למען שמו באהבה מלך עוזר ומושיע מוגן ברוך אתו אדוני מוגן אברהם אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני מחיים מייסים התורה ולהושיע מולידתו מכלכל חיים בחסד מחיים מייסים ברחמים רבים סומך נופלים ורופא חולים עתיר אסורים קיים מנסו לשני עפר ויחמוך בעל גיבורו סומידי מלך מימיס ומחיה מצמיח ישועה ונאמרתו לחיות מייסים ברכתו אדוני מחיי המייסים קדש שמך בעולם כשם שמקדיש שמו עשה בשמי מרום ככסוב לידים ויחד וקורזל זה ויאמר קדוש 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 רואי צבאות מלוך ורס כבודו למסע ברוך ימירו ברוך אדוני ממך עמוד ויקשך כסוב לאמור מלוך אדוני לעולם היחציון לדור ודור הללויה לדור ודור נגיד גודלך ולנצח נצחים כשעשך נקדיש שמך חולן מפירה למשה לעולם ואת כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה ברוכתו אדוני אוהל הקדוש אתה חונן לו דום דעת סלמית אנוש בינו חונן מתחודי אבינה והשכייה ברוכתו אדוני חונן הדעת השיבינו אבינו לסור סר קרבין מלכנו לבוא דסך וחסרים בשביל שלם בפניך ברוכתו אדוני רוצה בתשובה סלח לנו אבינו כי חטאנו מחל מלכנו כי פשענו כי מלכה וסלח אתה ברכתו אדוני חנון המרבה לסלוח ואינו אביוני ריבו ריבנו וגולין למען שמך כי גואל חזק אתה ברכתו אדוני גואל ישראל עננו אדוני עננו ביום סום תניסנו כי בצר גדול אנחנו אל תפן אל ראשנו ואל תסתר פניך ממנו ואל תזלם מתחינתנו כי אינו קרוב לשבתנו, אינו חסדך לנחמנו, טרם נקרא לך עננו, קדוש נאמר, וטרם יקראו ואני אענה, או הם מדברים ואני אשמע, כי עצו אדוני העונה ביעי שרה, צפודה ומציל בכל עץ שרה וסוכה, ברכתו אדוני, העונה ביעי שרה. רפואינו אדוני בני רופא, הושענו ונבושע, כיסי לעשינו אתה ולרפואה, שלמה לכל מעקסינו, כי המלך רופא נאמן ברחמן אתה, ברכתו אדוני. רופא חולי עמו ישראל. ברך חולנו אדוני אלוהינו אשר נעזוז כל מיני סבוסה לטובה ושם ברכה פני אדמה וסבינו בטובך וברך שנושאנו כשנים הטובות ברכתו אדוני מבורך השונים תקע בשופר גדול לחירוסנו ושונס רבי סגול ליוסנו וקבצני יחד מארבע כנפות הארץ ברכתו אדוני מקבץ נדחי עמו ישראל הושיבה שבתנו כבוד ראשונה ויועצנו גבה תחילה ואוסר ממנו יגום בנחה ומלוך עלינו עצו אדוני לבדך בחסד וברחמים בצדקנו במשפט ברכתו אדוני מלך אוהב צדקה ומשפט והמלשין אל תיסק בו בכל רשע כרגע טובת בכל אויבי עמך מהר יקרסו ועשיתם מהירו סקרו שבר וסמגר סכני בהר בימינו ברכתו אדוני שובר אויבים ומכניע הזידים על הצדיקים ועל החסידים ועל זקני עמך בישראל ועל פליטת ספריהם ועל גרי הצדק ועלינו ימונו רחמך אדוני אלוהינו ושאין שכר טוב בכל לבוטחים שמך באמץ ושמחה וקרם מהם לעולם לא נבוש כי בך בטחנו ברכתו אדוני משען ומבטח לצדיקים וירושלים עירך ברחמים תשוב ותשכון בשכר כאשר דיברת ובני עושו בקרוב בימי בניין עולם בכיסא דוד מהירו לשכר תוכים ברכתו אדוני בוני ירושלים שמחת ברבתך מהרס עצמיה בקרנו תרום בישועתך כי לישועתך קיווינו כל היום ברכתו אדוני מצמיע קרן ישועה שמע קולנו אדוני אלוהינו חוס ורחם עלינו וקבל ברחמים ורצון את סבירתנו יהל שומע תפתחנו אתה ומלפניך מלכנו ריקם אל תשיבנו כי אתה שומע תפילת עמך ישראל ברחמים ברכתו אדוני שומע תפילה say Adonai בעמך ישראל וספילתם ושיש ועודו בשכה בישי ישראל וספילתם יבוא סקבל ברצון תפיל רצון תמיד עבודת ישראל עמך בשכה זנו עינינו בשובך לציון ברחמים ברכתו אדוני המחזיר שכינה עשה לציון מודים אנחנו לך בשעתו הוא אדוננו ואלוהי ושנו לו ויצור חיינו מגן ישנו עצור לדודו דלכו ספרתי לשכה על חיינו המסורים בידיך ויעל נשמוסנה בקדוש לך ויעל ניסרה שבכל יום ממנו ויעל נפלוסך דובסך שבכל עץ ערב ובוקר וצהריים חטוב כי לא יכול לרחמך ומרחם כי לא שמו חסדיך מעולם קיווינו לך יל כולם יסברך וישרומן שמך מלכנו תמיד יולד וכל החיים יודיך סלע ויעלו שמך בימי ישראל ישועתנו ויעזרנו סלע ברוך אתה אדוני הטוב שמך ולכנו אל ההודות שים שלום טוב וברכה כן חס ורחמים לנו ועל כל ישראל עמך ברכנו אבינו כולנו כי יכול ביור פניך כי ביור פניך סתלנו ודרנו תורס חיים ביאבס חסד וצדקה וברכה ורחמים בחיים בשלום וטוב בעיניך וברך עמך ישראל בכל ישראל שב בשלומך ברוך אתה אדוני המברך עמו ישראל בשלום יסקדל ויסקדש מרבה יעמוד יברך ירוסי וימלך מחוסי בחייכון ובמיכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל בעגל הזמן קריב יאמרו אמן איש מרבה מבורך כי עולם רמי עולמיה יספורך וישתבח ויספואר וישרומם ויסנשא ויסדר ויסעלה ויסעלול שמי דקדושה בריחו יעלה מכל בחסה ושרסה ושרסה ונחמסה תמירם ביעלמה ויאמרו אמן Sicha. Open the doors and you take the second Torah from the left. Ayim Zara Yom Moshe. Who's standing over? Where is he? Where is he?
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, here. She's sleeping in. There we are. Okay, who's in here? I think there's somebody here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's probably a thing. Huh. Oh, good, you're over there. Okay. See that, huh? 83. Sikala was Ramal Kozen and Buzan Krov, Hope the State of Place, my soil against the Rachamim in the Marmain. Hakal Hobagolenus, Kotora, Kain Kravia mode. Reverend Gillard, and Harab. Baruch Dover Hakko, hey, Baruch for some of the Dusha, so you are some of the Kim at the Tem. I am going to my own. He's so funny.
Well, then I'm rough.
Baruch
I'm broke out to the night, and I'm sure Bahaman make a minute on the way. So broke out to the night,
Amen. Ki solid bonim uvnei bonim roshantem bores vishchatem. Vasisem pesal tzmurasko. Vasisem horab yenei ador lechachiso. Hayedos ibachem hayom es hashemayim b'es hores. Yovoto veidu maher. Me'al hores asheratem ovorim es hayardein shama urishta. Los arichun yomim oleh ki yishamet shemedun. Vehefis adon hoyeschem ba'amim. Nishatem mesem espar ba'goyim ashinahe gadon hoyeschem shama. V'vartem sham Elohim ma'aseh yedei adam. Eitz forever asher lo yirun v'lo yishma'un v'lo yochalun v'lo yirichun. Uv'gashtem misham es adon lecha o matzasa. Ki sidrashenu v'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha.
Lama Shabbat Mekayim Baruch Atah Adonai Noten Torah.
Amen. Yeah, Molech Rav Tzvi Shmuel ben Yitzchak Avraham Halevi.
That might be. Baruch Hu es Adonai HaMavorach. Baruch Adonai HaMavorach. L'olam v'brachato. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'asam lanu es toraso. Baruch Adonai nosein haTorah. בצר לך ומסעוך כל הדברים האלה באחריס הימים בשבתו עד אדוני אלוהיך ושמעתו בקולו כי אל ברחום אדוני אלוהיך לא ירפך ולא ישחיסך ולא ישכח את בריס אבותיך אשר נשבע להם כי שאלנו לימים ראשונים אשר היו לפניך למען היום אשר ברא אלוהים אדם על הארץ ולמקצה השמיים וקצה השמיים הנהיה כדבר הגדול הזה או הנשמע כמו השמיים כל אלוהים מדבר מתוכו אש כאשר שמעת אותו ויחי או הניסו אלוהים לבוא לקחת לו גוי מקרב גוי במסוס ובסוס ובמופסים ובמלחמה וביד חזקו ובזרועותיו ובמוראים גדולים ככל אשר עשה לכם אדוני אלוהיכם במצרים לעיניך אתה הרי סולדס כי אדוני הוא אלוהים אין עוד מלבדו ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת בחיי עולם ותבשרנו ברוך אתה אדוני נושא התורה יעמוד הרי מרדכי ומשה זה שלישי אוקיי מהשמיים מהשמיים
Baruch Hu es Adonai Baruch, Baruch Adonai Baruch Leolam Boed, Baruch Atu Adonai Lenu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol U'Amim V'Nasa Lanu Es Torah So Baruch Atu Adonai Nosein HaTorah.
Amen. מן השמיים ישמעך את קולו ליסרק ביד הארץ הראך את אישו הגדולו ודבריו שמעת מתוך אש וסחס כי אוהב את אבותיך ויבחר בזרעו אחריו ויוציאך בפניו בכוחו הגדול ממצרים להוריש גויים גדולים ועצומים ממך מפניך להביאך ולשאת לך את ארצם נחלו כיום הזה וידעתו היום והשב עושה אל לבביך כי אדוני הוא אלוהים בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד ושמרת את חוקו ואת מצוותיו אשר אנוכי מצווך היום אשר ייטב לך ולבניך אחריך ולמען תאריך ימים על האדמה אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך כל הימים
Baruch Atu Adonai Lenu Melech Haolam Asher Nasa Lanu Torah V'Naz L'Chayei Olam V'Tabasokenu Baruch Atu Adonai Nosein HaTorah.
Baruch Atah Adonai Melech Haolam Asher Nasa Lanu
יסקדל ויסקדש שמי רבו עמוד יברוך ירוסי ויום נחמך עושה בחיי חונו ויומי חונו בחיי כל בית ישראל ועגולו בזמן קורי ויאמרו אמן שמי רבו מבורך יעולם ורבי עולם היה יספורח וישתבח ויספואר וישרומם ויסנעשה ויסהדר ויסהלב ויסהלול שמי קדושה בריחו יעילו מכל בחסה בשירו עשה תשור עשה ונחם עשה תמירה ביעלמו ויאמרו אמן Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, and Jerusalem, Rabbi Yisrael, Cholim, so the names of the sick. Chol HaCholim, Rabbi Yisrael, Cholim, Spak, Kol Ruchim, Al-Rachim, Al-Bachimam, Lachosam, Lachazikam, Lachiyosam, Yishach Lehem, in Refuah, Shlim, Refuah, and Refuah, V'so Shukol Yisrael, Hashul, Man, Kol Yidin, Omar, Amen. Yom Yom Al-Diyah, V'Hacholem. You did a good job.
Tried.
Excellent.
It's to the tune of Eichel, right? Except for the last two.
Just finished reading the Torah section from Dvarim now we return to one of our guides today, Voice of Yirmiyahu, reading from chapter 8 of Yirmiyahu. Follow along with the doctor on page 87 in a minute. Dr. Newman.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher bokar v'yim tovim rotzav divrei v'nemorim be'emes. Baruch atah Adonai aboker b'torah Moshe abdo b'Yisrael amo v'yei u'emes v'tzedek asof asifeim ne'um Adonai Ein anovim b'gefen vein teinim b'teina ve'elon ovel v'tein lohem yavrum alma anachnu yoshvim yasifu v'navo el arei hamitzar v'nidmasham ki Adonai Eloheinu adimanu v'yashkenu merosh ki chatanu l'Adonai avei l'shalom v'yein tov l'eis marpei v'nei b'yosa Nidan ishmanach rasusa mikol mitzalos abirab roasha kol haaretz vayavo vayachlu eretzum lo ha'ir v'yoshvei ki ani mishaleach v'chem nichashim tzonim asher ein lohem lochash v'nishu eschem ne'um Adonai mavligitzi alei yagon olai libi davoi Hine kol shavas pasamei me'eretz marchakim Hadonai ein b'tzion imalka ein ba mado hichisuni b'psileihem behavlei nechor avar kotzir kolokoyetz v'anachnu lo noshanu al shever basamei hoshbarti Kodarti shama hazikosni Hatzei ein bigilad imrofei ein sham ki Madua lo also aruchas pasamei Mitein roshimayim b'yeini mekordema Yevchei yomam v'layla eis chalalei basamei Mietnani b'midbar milon orchim ez voes ami milcha meitam ki chulam enoafim atzeres bogdim vayedrichu es lishonam kashtam sheker v'lo lemuna gavru ba'aretz ki meira el ra yatzau v'yosi lo yadonu madonai ishmereyu ishameru v'yakolach al tiftachu Ki chalach hakov Yaakov chorei Rachel yaloch V'yishvireyu yihaselu v'yemes lo yidaberu Limdu lishonam daber sheker havein elu Shivtecha b'soch mirma b'mirma V'yanuda sosi ne'um Adonai lachein Ko amar Adonai tzvos in nitzarfam u'v'chantem Ki echesem mipnei basami Chet shachod lishonam mirma diber B'fib shalom esreyehu yidaber U'v'kirbo yosim arbo Hal'ela lo efkod bam num Adonai Im begoy asher kazeh los isnakein nafshi Al he'arim esa b'chi v'nahi Yalos midbar Kinot kinetzitzum ibliei shover V'lo shamu kol mikneh Miof hashamayim yad behema nadidu halachu V'nosati es Yerushalayim ligalim miontanim V'esarei Yehuda et ein shmamam ibli oshev Mio yishech chacham yavein azos V'asher diber pi Adonai elav yagida Alma of the haaretz and Sisok hamidbar mibli over Vayomer Adonai alazva es Torasi, Asher Nosati, Lifnehem, Lo Shamu Bikoliv, Lo Holchu Ba, Vayelichu, Acharei, Shvirus Libam, Acharei Habolim, Asher Limdum, Avosam, Lochein, Ko Amar Adonai Tzivos Elohi Yisrael, Hineni Machilam, Esamazeh Lana, Vishkisim Merosh, Vafitzosim Agoyim, Asher Lo Yadu, Hema Vavosam, Vishilach Achrayim Esacherev, At Kalosi Osam, Ko Amar Adonai Tzvos, Hisbonenu, Vikirula Mikonenos, Usfoena, Velachachamo Shilchu, Visavona, Usmaherna, Visisen Oleinu Nehi, Visiradna, Ainenu Dima, Viafapenu, Yeslumayim, Kikol Nehi, Nishma Mitzion, Ekshudadnu, Boshnu Miol, Kiazabnu Eretz, Ki Ishlichu, Mishkenoseinu, Kishmana Noshin, Dvar Adonai, Visikach was Nechem, Dvar Pev, Vila Maiden of Nosechem Nehi, Vishari Usa, Kina, Ki Allah Maves, Bechalonenu, Bab, Yarmoneseinu, Lakriz, Olol Michuds, Bachurim, Merkovos, Taber, Kol Neom Adonai, B'nafla Nevlas Adam, Kidom, and Apnei Hasadeh, B'chamir, Me'achrei HaKotzer, Yein Me'aseh, Ko Amar Adonai, Al Yishalel Chacham, B'chachmaso, Al Yishalel HaGibar, B'gvuraso, Al Yishalel Oshir, B'yashro, Kimizos, Yishalel HaMishalol, Haskel, V'yado Osi, Ki Ani Adonai, Oseh Chesed U'mishpat, Mishpat Utztaka Baretz K'biela Chafatzti Nom Adonai Baruch Atu Adonai Leinu Melech Olam Tzurko Mem Sadik V'Kol Adoros V'Elanem On Omer V'Yosem Daberim Kayem Shekol Dvarav Emes V'Tzedek Neman Atu Adonai Eloheinu Nemanim Dvarecha V'Davarecha Midvarecha Chor Lo Yeshuv Rikam Kiel Melech Neman Rachamon Ata Baruch Atu Adonai V'Elanem On Mechol Dvarav Rachem Al Tzion Ki Beis Chayenu V'Alu As Nefesh Toshia B'Meira B'Yameinu Baruch Atu Adonai V'Sameach Tzion B'Voneha Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu B'Eliyahu Navi Abdecha Malchus Beis David Mishichecha B'Meira Yavo V'Yogel Libeinu Al Kiso Lo Yeshev Zar Lo Yinchalu Ad Acherim Es Kvodo Kivshem Kajachon Ishbat Lo Shelo Yekbenei Roli Olam Voed Baruch Atu Adonai Mogen David.
I'll tell you, I know how to pick shlishi.
B'Shem Adonai Ki Yizkov Shemo Levado.
Everybody could kindly be seated. We're a little ahead of schedule that we were thinking when we were planning the morning. Unfortunately, that doesn't make the fast end earlier. We'll get going. There's a source sheet, and there are also those following online. Hopefully the sources will be posted. If anybody needs, there's some more source sheets up front. We just read in the Haftorah from Yirmiyahu, the poignant Haftorah from chapter 8, which gets to the heart of the matter in a verse that says, Amma avda haaretz. Why did all of this happen? To which God answers, Al ozvam et torati asher natati lifnehem velo shamu bekoli velo halchu ba, because they abandoned my Torah, God says. They didn't live by my Torah. On Tisha B'Av, we enact that abandonment of Torah, because one of the things that is prohibited, along with food, water, and the most basic physical sustenance, is spiritual sustenance, Torah. It's at least prohibited in its standard manner. But there's a tradition, at least in certain circles, especially I would say in the circles of students of Rabbi Soloveitchik, that on Tisha B'Av we refuse to totally abandon Torah. Even though we can't study in the regular fashion, we use this morning to focus on certain sections and certain themes, and as Rabbi J.J. Schachter pointed out about Rabbi Soloveitchik, broadly defined, because when we focus on one theme in Torah, that intersects with other themes of Torah, and we find a back door, as it were, to meditate, to reflect on Torah, and to my mind, to respond to Yirmiyahu and say, we don't want to fall into that trap. We want to do the tikkun as much as we can. We want to return to the Torah with a deeper connection, to learn from its teachings, to follow its ways, to lift ourselves, to lift one another, to lift the world. So following in that tradition of Rabbi Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, Rabbi J.J. Schachter should live a long life, shlita. I want to, this morning, briefly focus on one theme that actually requires more elaboration. Maybe at some future point I could elaborate further, and go through a few sources which actually touch on a few questions, but one main theme, a suggestion, and hopefully it's a suggestion we could carry with us throughout the day. And then we'll turn to Kinot, and the Kinot too will add here and there some exposition. If you look at the Rambam, source 1, just two sides here. If you look at the Rambam, source 1, the Rambam restates a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Ta'anit. And the Mishnah in Ta'anit asks, what is this fast day all about? Why are we fasting on Tisha B'Av? Actually, before looking at source 1, does anybody want to suggest why are we fasting today? What are the basic reasons that we're fasting? Why the 9th of Av? The Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Which Beis HaMikdash? Both. So those are the primary reasons. Okay. Any other reasons? The spies. Excellent. Any other reasons? Beitar, the spies, I'm sorry, let's just say we're all on the same page. The two destructions of the Beit HaMikdash that I think we got 6th century BC and 1st century CE, one by the Babylonians, one by the Romans. Then the spies, meaning the story in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, where the spies went to the promised land and came back with a defamatory report, which led to a very different desert sojourn or journey through the desert, elongated Plan B, which is sort of the paradigm for tragedies, and according to tradition, that happened on Tisha B'Av. That's 3 reasons. 4th reason is Beitar. Beitar is a major tragic site from the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So we're moving from the 1st century CE to the 2nd century CE, around 132 through 135. Bar Kokhba and those of his followers, many followers, including some leading rabbis like Rabbi Akiva, had a 3-year rebellion, a very heroic rebellion once again. Sometimes scholars call this the second revolt against the Romans, post the revolt of 70 CE. This is the second one, and there was great tragic loss, a slaughter of a city, Beitar. That's 4 reasons. And then a 5th reason is what we'll read here in the Rambam, and the last line here, the evil Roman emperor, Turnus Rupus, plowed the Temple Mount. Now, without actually looking at the Rambam, or if you know it, don't say, and if you look, don't say, which one of these is the most important reason, the most basic reason of why we have a Tisha B'Av? Which one do you think is the most basic reason why we have Tisha B'Av? We gave 5 reasons. I would think the destruction of the temple. First temple, second temple, I don't know, both. Tie. That to me seems obvious. The main focus of this day is destruction of the temple. And then we're showing, tragically, that there are earlier roots and subsequent echoes. And as Rabbi Schneier said, sadly, or the way historians would say, in a lachrymose sense, in a tearful sense, the Jewish story shows that it goes well beyond Beitar, the plowing of the temple, and Tisha B'Av has been a dark day throughout Jewish history, from the spies all the way onward, should it be no more. And yet, let's read the Rambam briefly together. I'll read it in the Hebrew, but it's also here in the English. Tisha B'Av v'chamisha dvarim mirubo. There were 5 things that happened on Tisha B'Av. Again, the Rambam is based on a Mishnah. Nigzar al Yisrael b'midbar shelo yikansu la'aretz. The decree related to the spies not to enter into the land immediately during the desert. Charav habayit barishona uvashniya. Destruction of the 1st and 2nd temple. Now we're up to reason number 4. V'nilkeda ir gdola ubeitar shma. There was a conquest of a major city known as Beitar in the land of Israel. V'ayuba alafim urevavot misrael. And there were thousands and tens of thousands of Jews who lived in Beitar. V'ayalahem melech gadol. And they had a great king as a leader. V'dimu kol Yisrael v'gdolei hachachamim shehu hamelech hamashiach. And all of Israel and great sages thought that this great king, meaning Bar Kokhba, is the king, the Mashiach. V'nafal biyad goyim, and he and they fell in the hands of the Gentiles. V'nergu kulam, and there was a terrible, tragic slaughter of all of them. V'ayta tzora gdola kmo churban hamikdash. And there was a tremendous, painful tragedy on the level, as it were, of the destruction of the temple. Reason number 4. And now reason number 5. Ubo b'yom ha'muchan leparanot. And on this day that is preordained for tragedy, by this point, also, reason number 5, Charash Turnus Rupus Harasha Mimachei Adam et Haichal Vetzvivav Lekayem Tzion Sadeh Techarash. Turnus Rupus, the wicked emperor, plowed over the Temple Mount. So, of the 5 reasons, which reason does the Rambam spotlight? Which reason does the Rambam spotlight? This is interactive today. I can't learn alone. It's too long a day. Beitar. This is a very surprising Rambam to my mind. Had we not had this Rambam, I never would have predicted it. The Rambam actually focuses on the temple in passing, economy of words. The Rambam shows what a master author he is. He could be laconic. He could say in terse formulation, Charav habayit barishona v'shniya. But when it comes to Beitar, he dedicates numerous lines to describe Beitar, to describe what was at Beitar, who was at the fore, the potential, and onward. And this surely is surprising and raises a question, why? I want to put that on the side and suggest something, but I'll circle back. I want to pose two more questions, and the two more questions are also, I think, challenging in their own right. And I want to deal with questions 2 and 3 together, and then circle back to question 1. Question 2 relates to source 2. Source 2 is a passage that I've alluded to in the past few weeks if you have been in here in Synagogue when we've been discussing, but if not, no problem. If you're watching on YouTube, no problem. Let's read it together. It's a passage from Rabbi Soloveitchik, which we have yet to read together inside, so let's read together inside. Rabbi Soloveitchik contrasts personal mourning, which according to the Talmud is described as new mourning, a fresh wound. God forbid if somebody loses a member of their nuclear family. And Rabbi Soloveitchik compares and contrasts that with what we're doing today, national mourning, which in the Talmud is described also as ancient mourning. And Rabbi Soloveitchik points out the following. Let's read it together. Source 2. I would ask somebody to read, but I want it to be clear on the microphone, so I better do it. Avelut Chadasha is a spontaneous response, neither premeditated nor planned, to the sudden attack or onslaught of evil, catastrophe, disaster, or death. God forbid somebody suddenly confronts tragedy in their inner circle. That's a fresh wound, Avelut Chadasha. As opposed to, end of the second line, source 2, Avelut Yeshana is cultivated, gradually evolving through recollection and through the unitive time awareness. These are fancy words, but what Rabbi Soloveitchik is after is when it comes to the historic mourning that we're doing together now, this season, 3 weeks, 9 days, Tisha B'Av, on an annual basis, we actually go through a gradual process. It's a gradual one. We're not suddenly confronted with a terrible new reality, but it's an ancient reality that we know. It's part of the Jewish story. It's part of the baggage we carry around with us collectively. And we find ways each year to re-engage with it and to look at it anew. But the way we do that is we slowly, gradually get in that mood. And here we get to the underlined lines. The main distinction between the two types of mourning expresses itself in the reversal of the order of stages. When it comes to Avelut Chadasha, a new wound, God forbid, it commences with the most intense, the most poignant, the highest state of grief, Aninut, and slowly recedes to Shiva, Shloshim, Yudbet. What Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying is what we all know. If God forbid somebody is in mourning, if somebody is comforting somebody in mourning, we know that the hardest time is the initial loss, the funeral, then the Shiva, and then gradually we lighten the intensity of the mourning or the comforting of the mourner, 30 days, and for a parent, 12 months, until it fades into a lingering melancholy. All of that is the reverse of what we do when we have our national mourning. Avelu Shana follows a reverse course, right? We start out with the least intensive, the 3 weeks, which Rabbi Soloveitchik argues parallels the 12 months. It starts out with Avelut of the 12 months, the mildest form of mourning, which represents a sadness. This is usually non-conative, non-explosive, gradually turns into Avelut Shloshim and grows in its intensity until it reaches the pitch of Shiva. That's what we've been doing, right? 3 weeks, that's the least mourning. 9 days, more intense, following the paradigm of from 12 months to 30 days. Then we get to Tisha B'Av, and Rabbi Soloveitchik explains at length in various places that Tisha B'Av is like a Shiva. And Rabbi Soloveitchik explains that's why we reverse things. Now, that to me is a beautiful explanation, but I want to explore whether there's an additional explanation we can suggest, at least to think about. Here's question 2. I just want it to be clear. Why do we do things when it comes to Tisha B'Av in reverse order of what we normally do in the morning ritual? Morning ritual is usually the most intense morning first, and then we lighten and ease. And here it's the opposite. We begin with the 3 weeks, like the 12 months, then the 9 days, like the 30 days, and then Tisha B'Av itself, like the Shiva. We do things almost reverse. And I would just add one other point to show one other curiosity, that according to tradition, when is the actual death that we're mourning today of destruction? It's actually tonight, which adds to the puzzle. It's as if we do everything in reverse order, and the final point is the tragedy. Very puzzling. Question 2. I'm not sure I have perfect answers to these questions. That's why we think about it this year and for the next years. But I think they're all important questions. I'm going to suggest a certain direction. Question 3, based on source 3. Another fascinating source directly related to Tisha B'Av. It's a Talmudic passage which is based on a chapter in Yirmiyahu with parallels of sorts in the Book of Kings. There's a confrontation between two figures. Let's get into the scene. Two protagonists. On the one hand, the prophet that's with us throughout today, who we heard last night and we heard this morning in the Haftorah, Yirmiyahu. And on the other, one of the kings, one of the last kings of Judah, Yoyakim. And they had a very tense relationship. Because we know even in modern English, to be a Jeremiad is to have bad news. And we know political leaders to this day don't like hearing bad news. Challenge of leaders all day long, they're facing crises and a lot of times dealing, right, with the next inflation report and how are you going to handle it and how are you going to spin it, or the next COVID report, God forbid, and onward. So, believe me, Yoyakim did not like seeing Yirmiyahu. But Yirmiyahu was not just an op-ed writer, or he wasn't even just a gadfly politician. He was a speaker, an oracle for God. And he had a message that he had to prophesy and share. And it was an alarming warning to Yoyakim about what is right around the corner, Yoyakim. Your kingdom is doomed. Babylonia is on the frontier. Their attack is imminent. Unless things change dramatically, the forecast is a disaster. Now, the Talmud gives this a certain normative, a halachic characterization. And it talks about how there was a burning of the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, a destruction of the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, that King Yoyakim tore it, shredded it, burnt it. But it gives us a more graphic account of this also. Source 3. Let's read a little bit together. The Talmud says that one rends one's garments when a scroll is burnt. What's the source? The Talmud says, well, look to what happened in this confrontation between the prophet Yirmiyahu, the prophet of doom, and King Yoyakim. As it says in the verse, Vayikro Yehudi shalosh laltot v'arba, Yikra'a b'tar ha'sefer v'ashlecha la'esh asher la'ach. So it says, as they were reading the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, according to the Talmud, the prophecy of Yirmiyahu was actually recorded. It was recorded in a scroll. Which scroll was it that was recorded? It becomes quite clear. We'll read it in 1 second. It says 3 or 4 columns. Maybe we should read it in the English. It'll be a little easier. Second line, as is written, and it came to pass when the Yehudi had read 3 or 4 columns that he cut in with a penknife, in source 3, third line, and cast it into the fire and that was in the brazier. And then, actually, I have to pick it up in the Hebrew. They asked, Amrule Yoyakim, they said, second line here, source 3, second line in the Hebrew. They said to, in Aramaic, they said to Yoyakim, Katav Yirmiyahu Sefer Kinot. They told the king, right, before he burnt the scroll, before he shred the scroll, they told him, listen, Yirmiyahu has prepared a scroll that has a prophecy. You should hear it. What is the scroll? Sefer Kinot. What's Sefer Kinot another term for? The book of Eicha. Does everybody get the drama of the scene? Yirmiyahu prepared the book of Eicha, and he wanted it to be read publicly. Actually, I'm not sure publicly, but he wanted it to be read before King Yoyakim, to hear the book of Eicha. And Yoyakim was skeptical, and Yoyakim was cynical about this book. And he says, Maktiv Bey. So they read him the first verse, so we should be clear that he's reading Eicha. Maktiv Bey, Eicha Yashva Badad. Eicha, how did the city sit lonely? To which Yoyakim responded, Amar lahu, Ana Malka. It's okay, I'm still king. Let him make whatever noise he wants. I'm not hearing the prophecy that my dynasty, my sovereignty is over. So then they keep going, and we don't need to read all of it inside, but Bachotifke Balayla, there will be crying, and he says, Ana Malka. Galtayuda Maoni, Judah will be exiled. He says, I'm still king. Until it says, Hayut Sareya Larosh. The enemies will rule, meaning rather than you. When he heard that, he burnt the entire scroll. Now, what's so odd about this story? I'm sorry, let me just recap to make sure everybody's with me. It's a Talmudic passage, and the Talmudic passage says Yirmiyahu read the book of Eicha to King Yoyakim, and Yoyakim heard it, and he said, what's in the book? And until he realized that what's in the book is also a statement
of the finality of his sovereignty, he just sat there numb. But when he heard that, in a rage, he destroyed the book of Eicha. What's so odd about this source? When is Eicha written? When is Eicha written by Yirmiyahu? Somebody said it? Say it out. It's written, we normally think it's written after the fact. But according to this source, it's written in advance. This is a revolutionary source, right? This is an entirely different spin on the book of Eicha. I'll read to you a different version of this. Maybe it would have been easier if I brought this version, but I only came across it last night. It's a version in the Midrash of Eicha. There's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah. Matai ne'emra. When was Eicha introduced? Rabbi Yehuda says, like this Talmudic passage, in the days of Yoyakim. And Rabbi Nehemiah says, Achar Churban Habayit. Rabbi Nehemiah says that it was said after the destruction. Amazing debate. I think we all always assume, like Rabbi Nehemiah, that Yirmiyahu witnessed the tragedy of the Churban and lamented. But actually, there's another opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda says all of Eicha was actually written as a prophecy in advance of the Churban and was read to the king in advance of the Churban, the last king, Yoyakim, telling him the terrible path that we're going down that's imminent and around the corner. And in the Talmud, listen to this line. In the Midrash, Rabbi Nehemiah turns to Rabbi Yehuda and he asks a very sharp question. V'chi bochin al hamet ad shelo yamut? Rabbi Nehemiah says, Rabbi Yehuda, I don't get it. The entire book of Eicha is the most intense mourning. Do you mourn in advance of the tragedy? How could you say this book was written in advance of the tragedy? The book is filled with mourning. By the way, turn the page. What's Rashi's position on the book of Eicha? An amazing Rashi. If you look at Rashi in the beginning of Eicha, source 4, Rashi says, Yirmiyahu Katav, Sefer Kinot, the author of Eicha is Yirmiyahu. He ha-Megillah asher saraf Yehoyakim. It is the scroll that the king Yehoyakim burnt. In other words, Rashi paskins, as it were, or interprets the book of Eicha according to the position that was said in advance. The position of Rabbi Yehuda. B'mei Yoyakim ne'emra. Despite the question of Rabbi Nehemiah, and do you cry in advance of the tragedy? Which is certainly question 3. Okay, I want to summarize 3 hard questions, actually all very hard questions. Question 1 is about the Rambam. Why does the Rambam spotlight Beitar of all tragedies? Question 2 is, why do we do our tragic mourning each year, our ritual of mourning in reverse order? And I'm sharpening that question. Not only do we go from 3 weeks to 9 days to Tisha B'Av, but all of that, on some level, is advance of the tragedy, which is only tonight, the 10th of Av. And question 3 What do we make of Rabbi Yehuda, of the Talmud, of Rashi, that the entire book of Eicha was actually formulated in advance of the tragedy? Bochin al hamet lifnei shu hamet. Does one mourn in advance of tragedy? Now, if you notice, questions 2 and 3 actually intersect. There's a parallel there. How is there a parallel there? Because in question 2, what did we talk about? We do the 3 weeks, and then the 9 days, and then Tisha B'Av, all in advance of the destruction. And question 3 is, we read Eicha in advance of the destruction. So minimally, whatever I say in the next couple of minutes, you could walk away with that point, and I think it's a powerful point. You see that there is something deliberate in the design of these days and of the way we ritualize these days, that a lot of the work we do is anticipating and in advance of the tragedy, which I would argue is the reverse of what we usually do with tragedy, and surely it is. Because, of course, tragedy is a new reality that, God forbid, confronts us, and then we have to come to terms with it. Right? Here, it's only in these kind of situations in a way that one could even imagine doing something in advance. But even if we could, it doesn't explain why we do it in advance. In other words, we know what's coming. We know that each year the 9th, 10th of Av are coming. We could do things in advance. And because Yirmiyahu knew what was coming down the road, he can tell it to, right? You need prophecy or you need a repeat to have the possibility of doing it in advance. It still doesn't explain why doing it in advance. Is everybody with me? In other words, I have 3 questions, but I'm just pointing out, I do think there's a structural design here to Tisha B'Av that to me is very surprising, that it's done in anticipation, in advance of the most tragic point. And now I want to try to take a stab at why that might be. So we have 2 more sources just that we have to look at together to try to figure out a little bit a direction of why this might be. Source 5, another very odd source that is not directly related to Tisha B'Av, but I think might shed light on what we do during Tisha B'Av. Source 5 asks, what is the source of Shiva? And there are various sources in the Talmud about Shiva. What is the source of Shiva? How do we know that you sit Shiva 7 days? This is a passage from the Jerusalem Talmud. So let's take the second position, the second explanation of Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, where it's underlined, source 5 towards the end. Rabbi Yaakov b'shem Rabbi Ze'era, Shamale min hada. So Rabbi Yaakov Baracha explains, this is the source of Shiva. Upetach oel moed teshvu yomam v'layla shivad yamim ushmartem and mishmeret mishkan Hashem. When it came to, these are verses from the book of Leviticus. I brought the verse over here from Vayikra. That when they constructed the Mishkan, the tabernacle, they were told to sit by the tabernacle for 7 days. Who was told to sit by the tabernacle, by the Mishkan for 7 days? Anybody remember? Who was told to sit? Presumably, or if you had to guess. Aaron, the high priest. They're the ones who are sitting, presumably, by the Mishkan. What does that have to do with Shiva? Can somebody explain the source? What a puzzling source already. That when they built the Mishkan, the high priest Aaron was told to sit there for 7 days. What does this have to do with Shiva? Because what happens on day 8 is a bit of a spooky Gemara. But on day 8, Vayhi Bayom Hashmini, on the 8th day of the consecration of the Mishkan, tragically, Nadav and Avihu perish. So what's this Yerushalmi passage saying? That when did Aaron sit Shiva? 7 days, maybe unbeknownst to him, in advance of the tragedy on day 8. Again, very, all these sources are very surprising. Not one source we've seen this. This is why you got to work hard at learning, right? Because every single source is a curveball, right? Every source is a surprise. They sat Shiva, Aaron, again, very haunting, in advance of day 8, and the Gemara gives a mashal, or compares it. Kishem sheshimer HaKadosh Baruch Hu al alamo shivam. In source 5, third, fourth line. Just like God sat Shiva, as it were, observed for 7 days in advance. Ask the Gemara, Uminayin, where does God sit Shiva over the world in advance? The Gemara answers an amazing, haunting Yerushalmi, Vayhi lishivat hayamim umei mabul hayu al haaretz. What does the Gemara answer? God, as it were, modeled this idea of sitting Shiva for 7 days over a world that would be destroyed at the end of the 7th day into the 8th day and on. What's this referring to? The flood. And that's a verse in Breshit, which is given a haunting reading by the Midrash. Why does God wait? I don't know if God decided to bring a Mabul. Bring a Mabul. It is a good question. Why does God wait to bring a Mabul? So when we get to Breshit, we could think about that question. And on Tisha B'Av, we read it through the lens of this Yerushalmi, and it gives a haunting answer. God sat Shiva for the world for 7 days, and at the end of the Shiva, the world died. I would say God forbid, but it happened in the Mabul. The world was destroyed. It's an amazing, haunting Yerushalmi. But the Yerushalmi is also perplexing. The Yerushalmi says, how do we know you sit Shiva? And the Yerushalmi has a debate. We skipped one opinion that's more straightforward, and we read this opinion. And the opinion points to 2 places in the Torah where the Yerushalmi, according to this sage, sees a Shiva. One is Aaron sits 7 days of Shiva for Nadav and Avihu, and the other is God sits Shiva for the world which will be destroyed by the Mabul. But what the Yerushalmi doesn't underscore, and we must as students of the Yerushalmi, is in both cases the Shiva happened like what we're noting that we're doing now in advance of the tragedy. Again, that could only happen if there's a type of a prophecy, if God's in on it, which of course God's in on it when it comes to the Mabul, and God's in on it when it comes to Nadav and Avihu. God could tell Aaron, sit in advance. We don't know whether Aaron understood what's going on or not. But according to the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, that's what's going on. So again, God knows in advance everything, but why do Shiva in advance? We still have that question. I want to suggest perhaps an answer based on one last source, and this is the last source, and then we'll try to just tie the threads to at least have a direction to think about. There's a very moving poignant source from Jewish history, taking the form of a responsa, which is also moving. It's the Mari Tats. I know, Dr. Seaman, you were just in Tzvat, right? At the Berlan Bar Mitzvah in Tzvat. And it's nice even in the stark morning to think about joyous occasions and to get hope where we're going to head. In Tzvat, one of the remarkable things, and Dr. Seaman could share with us afterwards, is visiting all the synagogues and encountering all these epic figures from Jewish history, especially from the 16th, 17th century, like Rav Yosef Karo and others, the Alshech and others. Right there in their circle is a figure that maybe we know less about, but in his lifetime he was a leading rabbi, and thank God we have some of his writings, named Rabbi Tzahalon. And it was a string of rabbis, and sometimes his acronym is based on Morenu, Harav, etc., Tats. So Maharitats. And the Maharitats lived in Tzvat, but actually was a representative of the rabbis and went to Istanbul and went to Egypt. And he lived this important life, but also he painfully faced tragedy in his own family. And he lost in a pandemic, in a plague. He lost a child. And this broke him. And he was an itinerant, I believe, for a bit during this period. But he moved around, strayless, restless, but also writing Torah responsa. And here, to me, this is part of what's precious about Tisha B'Av and precious about the Kinot. Sometimes to get a window into a Torah which guides us even in the saddest of chapters is a very poignant and precious Torah. And here's an example. He asks a question. Let's describe it largely outside, and then we'll read just a few lines inside. It's a terrible question. The question is, when you visit a loved one who has passed, and you go to the Beit Almin, you go to a cemetery, there's a halacha, maybe some are familiar, it's a halacha you should be familiar, that you're not supposed to pray right proximate to the grave, within 4 cubits of the grave. And it's a discussion, certain other things, but basically, mitzvot, you're not supposed to do mitzvahs right near the grave. This is called loeg larash, mocking the one who is impoverished. And the idea is, it's a bit of an intense idea, but the idea is, it's really, I think, more a reminder for us, the living, that this is our time to get going to do mitzvahs. This is our time to pray. This is our time to, when we're beating, when we're vibrant, when we're vigorous, and we should use our time well to do mitzvot. And sadly, those who have passed to the other world, as much as they're in the highest elevated places, they can no longer do the practical mitzvot. And we don't go into their space, as it were, and do mitzvot. So he asks a halachic question. I'll just read from the first line. Does this halacha apply to a minor? What's the idea? What's the question? God forbid if you're visiting, again, very painful stuff to imagine, but Maritats lived through this. If you're visiting the grave of somebody who, God forbid, or Rahman al-Islam in his case, perished at such a young age, who's not even bar mitzvah, so they're not even obligated to do mitzvot. So you're not, in a sense, saying, even indirectly, I'm doing mitzvot and you're not, because this person is not a person who was ever obligated to do mitzvot, as sad as that is. That's his question. It's one thing if you come to visit the cemetery of somebody who did a lot of mitzvot in their lives and was obligated there, you should be respectful. But here, this minor never was obligated to do mitzvot. So the Maharitats, and we understand this is not a theoretical question. This is a question that breaks his own heart. That he lost a child who didn't even make it to bar mitzvah in a plague. Read the last few lines together, underline lines. V'nira lomar da'asur. I'm inclined to say that one has to be respectful. One does not do mitzvot proximate to the grave of a minor. Da'afilu lahach tama nami shayach gabe katan v'ulai shayach tfei loeg l'rash. Maybe actually we should be even more mindful, more respectful in proximity to the grave of a minor, Rachmana litzlan, who died before bar mitzvah. Sheyomar hakatan hinei ze loeg alai shelo higati lishnotav. Because in a sense, it's the worst form of mockery to present before a person whose life was cut off way too soon, who could never actualize a life of being commanded of mitzvot in this world. A very poignant responsa. This responsa of Rabbi Tzahalon, I think, captures something powerful that maybe sometimes is in us in a sense that's ineffable, and maybe it's a place that's hard for us to go. But I think psychologically, all those who have lost loved ones, on some level, cannot escape going there. And Rabbi Tzahalon goes there, especially in his circumstance. But I would argue, maybe on some level this is true in all circumstances, although no doubt more acute in the circumstance he describes. Namely, when we mourn over the loss of a loved one. We mourn over all that was so precious, so intimate, so formative. A love that was so palpable. What was? But there's also sometimes an annoying question of what could have been. What could have been? Were the person only here? I remember when I worked for years on a book, and I put my kishkas into the book, and I found out one day in an email from a publisher that I was working so hard to get a contract with, that somehow I had the blessing of landing a contract with this publisher, which for me was huge. And I so wanted to pick up the phone and call my mother at that moment. That was all I was thinking. And I got overwhelmed with that thought. It suddenly hit me in such a powerful way. I was almost shocked by where it came out of. If only right now I could pick up the phone and call my mother. What could have been just for me, that moment, to pick up the phone and share the news. And of course, al pi kama v'kama, when I got married, when I had a baby girl, and onward. It's hard to directly engage those thoughts because they sometimes are too much. And I think we have to deal with them in ways that are moderated as much as we can. But they're no doubt part of mourning. We don't just mourn about what was, we mourn about what could have been. And I think mostly the halakha tells us mourn by looking back. Try not to get so caught up in those thoughts that I just shared with you. Try to focus on what was, to appreciate what was, to be grateful for what was, to learn from what was, and try to continue as much as possible, not just was, but ongoing, even when the loved one is not here with us. In a tangible sense, they're with us in other ways and onward. But the Mahari Tats is saying there's a circumstance where the heart of the mourning is about what could have been. What could have been. For example, a mourning over a minor. Because what was, sadly, was way too short. And the Mahari Tats shows us his heart and bears his heart to us and says, when I mourn for my child who perished too young, I also mourn about what could have been. And I would argue that that makes a lot of sense of this Yerushalmi passage we just saw. When God mourned for the world of the Mabul, I would argue God, as it were, mourning, whatever that means, was mourning much more over what could have been of the world, not what was, because we know what was barely was. Maybe in the number of years, there were all sorts of years from Adam to Noah, but the book of Genesis barely has anything to tell us, just a few chapters. What could have been is an entire future of a world. And I would argue, and this is an argument, that when God sits Shiva in advance, as it were, it's focused looking ahead, it's a mourning for a future that never happened. It's mourning, as my title is today, the unwritten chapter. What could have been? And Aaron, about Nadav and Avihu. What do we know about Nadav and Avihu? That they worked one day in a tabernacle, part of a day. Of course, here too, it makes much sense that what Aaron mourned for Nadav and Avihu, the thrust of the mourning, the heart of the mourning was what could have been. What could have been. And I would argue that on Tisha B'Av, on some level, in addition to mourning what was, what we mourn on Tisha B'Av is what could have been. What could have been, or the Jewish story, one where there is a Jerusalem and is a temple, and that's the center of our universe, and what could have been. And that's hinted at Yirmiyahu mourning in advance. Do you cry over a dead before he dies? Yes, if you're crying about a future chapter that won't be. Yoakim, the future could be different. What could be? And we mourn in advance over what could be. When we mourn in advance, we're oriented towards the future. What could be? And for 3 weeks, and for 9 days, and for Tisha B'Av, in advance of the Churban this evening, we focus future. It's true, on Tisha B'Av, a lot of our Kinot look back, but I'm saying there's a dimension of Tisha B'Av of looking forward. What could be? What could have been? What could be? And I would argue, going back to our first source, which we'll wrap up with, the Rambam. A pretty amazing Rambam. 5 things happened on Tisha B'Av. But which one gets the most amplification? Which one gets the most space? Beitar. And how does the Rambam describe Beitar? I think once you look back, it's hard to miss. The Rambam doesn't just talk about who died in Beitar, but the Rambam talks about the potential of Beitar. What could have been Beitar? Beitar had a Melech Gadol, a great leader, Jews with a great leader in the land of Israel, who they all thought, sorry, not all thought, but many, actually Kol Yisrael thought in the Rambam's formulation. They all thought this could be the Messiah. There was potential for Mashiach. That's what was lost that day in Beitar. Beitar, what we lost was what could have been. Mashiach. It could have been then. More than we mourn over tragedy, Jewish history is sadly filled with tragedies, and we do mark them today. But in addition, we also mourn over the potential. The climate was there, the conditions were there, the potential was there, the personnel was there, the leader was there, the sages were there, what could have been. And that, in a sense, is the most painful thing that we mourn. I think what this means for us is that today we also, in addition to mourning over all the tragic events which we're about to turn to, part of what we do today is we think about what could have been. What could have been? What could have been a Jewish story if we had not, what do we have today? I don't know, 15 million? I don't know the exact numbers. What could have been if 20th century was different? What could have been? What a different story it could have been. So it's not just lives lost. It's a potential of what could have been. Part of that is just being honest about what was lost. But part of that is to motivate us when we look around and we see the potential of what we have today. When the Rambam is writing about Beitar, right, in the 12th century, the Rambam briefly lived in Israel and got quickly out of Israel because Israel was a backwater. Because Israel was dominated by Christians and Muslims. But today, when we think about what could have been, we're not just thinking about in the 2nd century CE what could have been, but today in the 21st century, what could be? What could be? We're back. We're back in Israel. We're back in Jerusalem. We're back with a sovereign government. Thank God. What could be? And actually, when we're honest, we look around and we see we have challenges, and we better mobilize ourselves, and we better galvanize ourselves. What could be? Because that's part of what we should think about today. The potential, lost potential in the past, and I would say even more important, the potential that is with us right now, and what could be. And if we observe Tisha B'Av properly, I think we'll be rededicated to ensuring that what could be will, in fact, be. Let's turn to the Kinot. on page 91. We'll go around. We'll start with on page 91. I'm going to ask different people to lead here and there. I'll just interject a little bit, but let's get going with some of the Kinot. The early ones are from the Kalir on page 91. We'll read, and of course we'll skip around a bit, but let's read the first few in 91. Rabbi Einstein.
Shavas Rimenu Shemauni Ocharoi, Schiama Oz Hesiuni Beedre Habiroi, Sakosa Mishkan Mischos Diboroi, Sakosa Buhulagu Giboroi, Safu Khaf Umadu Alvaroi, Kasila Al Hokol Abiroi, Nofla Odenu Betsul Duhuya, Eni Hikasol Lagazon Ben Berechia, Ad Pil Egil Gol Habuya, Eni Moleles Bivanit Nukhondia, also Benicham Baikrob La Bechia, Benom Al Elani Bechia, Al Penifodas Nubetsu Hasideha, Palge Sup Zochra Keoru Yesodeha, Pachat Chet Shilo, Tochap Sodeha, Potsu Hazire Yaar Aye Hasideha, Potsu Masi Ario Dilideha, Persa Tzion Biodeha, Al Har Tzion Sadu Shaone Midonoi, Sofu Al Roshi Zaydonoi, Samasu Beno Lamud Zaydonoi, Sod Natsarta La Orer Midonoi, so Ak Ami Hibi Maven Dinoi, Tadiku Adonoi. Ato Kalim Hichbarato Omedi Ermuni, Kirapta Boilai Bayachirumuni, Kolil Hashmia Ba'arav Higrig Muni, Korosil Yoshebe Givon, Gamhem Zeramuni, Kumi Avori Behosel He'erumuni, Korosil Mahabai Hemorimuni, Lama Ruachapenu Lotebach Shamaru, Ruisaki Khatanu Orenu Hamaru, Ruisaki Amal Bochas Bi Ibuyacha Gamaru, Rafto Biad Yechaskel Linkom, Kemomaru, Re'e Vinachidem Migoi Amaru, Re'ad Noiki Tsarli, Me I Hamar Maru, Hashivenu Sisi Shima, Lugoi Tseoni, Shiftom Ramos Chatserai, Lahat Kinaoni, Sipsei Mishorarei Devir Domamu, Lahad Bi Oni, Shamata Kizamoros Av Hechin Letataoni, Shachabu Benadu, Chotzat Lahabri Oni, Shamu Kinencha Oni, Kisam Chakto Beches Ofanecha, Toshiv Lohem Gemul, Keoz Chazos Panecha, Tirdov Salmon, Yoatzei Ra Altsifunecha, Titain Lahabhab Nosese Peninecha, Tikrol Shakaram Kos, Kalmus Befinecha, Tovoal Korosom Lefonecha, Kotovo Keltsor Ashechilanu, Lemavo Chamos Bechemo Nihalonu, Ad Lachlach Bechavor Higlanu, Zokeno Vochur Besula Kivolanu, Rom Habet No Amachol Chulanu, Zechor Adonai Mehoyolanu.
The Kinot are written in very challenging poetic Hebrew. They're written, a lot of them here, the 7th century debate about how to date, but I think now that's the common dating of the Kalir in beautiful poetic Hebrew. The truth is they began inserted in Shmona Esrei, at least some of them. And that's why this one began, that we just read, with the letter Suru, Shabbat, and then Suru, because it was, I believe they even say it here, and you could see over here, it was part of the Shmona Esrei, I think after Slach Lanu. So it was linked into the Shmona Esrei. Over time, because that makes sense. If you think even on holidays, we have different piyutim and liturgies, krovot, different, again, we could elaborate another time, but the great poets, beautifully, they elaborated on our Shmona Esrei to tailor it to the times of years. This is what's known as piyut, liturgical poems, beautiful, challenging Hebrew poems. And that's the beginning of some of these piyutim on Shmona Esrei for Tisha B'Av used to be longer because you'd have to read some of these liturgical poems into the Shmona Esrei, or a great poet would read them into the Shmona Esrei. Now, our practice is to read them after the Shmona Esrei, and here we see a little trace of that beginning. We'll turn now on page 93 to Eicha Atzta, And a lot of these Kinot are describing, in 7th century, they're looking back to the early Churban. The Churban, actually, the last one just mentioned Shiloh, even of the Mishkan, and some of these describe, of course, the Churban of the Beit HaMikdash, including the Second Temple. Rabbi Kahana, maybe.
חצת ביפיך לבית ביד אדומים אמנותך ולא זכרת ברית בין בטרם אשר בראת לבונך ובכן בשיתנו. נתת בין ערבך לגלות בים נעים גאולתך ולא זכרת דליגוד דרך אשר דיברת לגדליך ובכן דיברנו. אשר הגדת בעניונך לחרוף ביד חולים חמנותנך ולא זכרת ותוק ביוד וסד אשר וידעת לבעודך ובכן וכהוננו. איך זנחת וזמך לזלזל ביד זרים זבולך ולא זכרת חיתון חוטי חורב אשר חתך לחמולך ובכן חיווינו. אשר חרתך בתרחף לטרוף ביד טמאים תלכה ולא זרחת יקר ידידות יושר אשר יתת ליודך ובתן יעלנו. איך כיוונת וחצך לכלות ביד כושלים חרמך ולא זכרת ולא יזנח לעולם אשר לימדת לחוכך ובכן להגגנו. איך מיללת במעשך למחות ביד מונים מנסך ולא דרכך נשיאת נוצה נשר אשר נשת לנשואיך ובכן נהינו. איך זכת ושרתך ולסגר ביד סעפים שרדך ולא זכרת עוז עדיים אשר יתרת לעבודך ובכן ענינו. איך פצת בפתך לפגר ביד פריצים פעלה אחיך ולא זכרת צהלת צבי צדק אשר ספנת לצבאיך ובכן צעקנו. איך קראתך וקריאתך לכאן נוט ביד קמים קרואיך ולא זרקת רגש רכב ריבותיים אשר רצית לרעך ובכן רגינו. איך שאפת ושאפך לשלות ביד שוללים שלמך ולא זרקת תוקף טלטלי תואר אשר תקנתה לתמימך ובכן תעננו. תענו לשפוך כמים על מה ביום זה נשבענו פעמיים, זכרי בהיותי יושבת בשלווה בירושלים, רנניתי ועמתה עדה עד חוג שמיים.
Thank you. Maybe we could just turn back for 1 second. It's so hard. So maybe on page 93, let's just look at one of these lines together in the middle. Eicha zanachta bezamcha. How did you, that word eicha, picking up on eicha, that's our light word, right? The word that leads us throughout the day. And how did you abandon in your anger, bezamcha, l'zalzel biyad zarim zvulecha, to zilzul is to become cheapened and to be lessened in the hands of strangers. Zvulecha. Zvulecha is a reference to the temple. V'lo zacharta chitun chukei churev. And you didn't remember. In other words, what I want everybody to pick up is the tone of anger. How could you, God? Which is, one of the shocking things about this morning. Usually we approach God with such diffidence, but Tisha B'Av, Rav Soloveitchik emphasized, is a time where we could question. We don't leave it at the questions, but we could question, God, how could you? How could you leave a temple? How could you let Romans and Babylonians make a mockery and a cheapening and despise our temple? And you didn't remember chitun chukei chorev. Chitun, I think, from the language of to wed, the wedding of the laws of Chorev of Sinai. You didn't remember our bond, our wedding bond of Chorev. Asher chakachta lechamulecha, that you gave us laws that you decreed for those who you have compassion for. Uvechein chivinu, and then accordingly, because you forgot our marital bond, because you allowed this to happen, how could you? We experienced what we experienced. Remember God, mahayalanu. So it's a kina filled with a lot of questions, a lot of exasperation, and saying, God, don't you remember who we are to you and you are to us? Let's go the next one, and then we'll start skipping around. Adeh ad chug shamayim.
Aded chuk shamayim alale iti shamayim or yom machrivi pamayim es onein mitin rashimayim avchin bivchi yalil midbar avchana leil mileil midbar avke iti olas midbar es agav mi yitneni ba midbar egoda ve enoshel ki no kes Zayis, agare iti kol b'nei bayis, egrom shiomar bal habayis, ersha mi yitneni shamir v'shayis, et ve b'chol lev laham tsehu, ed a milin bam laham tsehu, ed ag ro'ev v'lo emta'ehu, akone mi ten yadati ve'emta'ehu, ehafcha, Ve'es hafcha ka'ofan b'milai ehege panim b'fanim lesanos amolai ahahu cheres v'sahar milhagiha l'mulai etzrach miyitain efo v'yichasvun milai orach mishpatei gonvei elai Odia bivtsi uma'ali umlalu mazalos bakori me'ili afuna mi yitain shame'ali adza kehufra ha'aviyona eskara ki ha'isa mechutana azil pelagim kav revcha ha'elyona Egor mi ten li aver kayona ach nifsha mikiryos ol el tzur achu balimayim ba'af latzor achaz kamos liktor v'lolelos liftor asicha mi yovileni ir matzor Eta ahale afadni betalmaves atusa v'eshkona ad chatzar maves etafel es hamechakim lamaves ehenem migever yichye v'lo yireh maves Yolusi le'ezrasi tarti lachazos ayumasi b'chol shana omeresi hashana hazos ayada lakol ki muadazos imi lo yeda ki yad Adonai asasazos ekof lecha rosh Adonai cheli ekra lecha berech lechatel machli achtir cha b'shir mishirei mecholi akavein mi yitencha ka'achli al tishkach tzakas Ariel elav le'egor Yehuda v'Yisrael alfei shinan asher masar el lemor mitain mitzionus Yeshuos Yisrael mi eis bidrachai lo halachu azavuni va'azavtim ufanai mehem nehapachu ragagti vehelalti umeyai v'libi nishbachu eicha tifarti meirashosai hishlichu.
We'll turn to page 102, where we were just reading. He used words from Yirmiyahu from the Haftorah, and Yirmiyahu is also behind the Kinot on 102. Vayakonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. And this is one of the clear examples that we have in the Tanakh from a Kinot, and it's explicitly a Kinot of Yirmiyahu. We have it from Divrei Hayamim, from the very end of the Bible, the book of Chronicles. And Yirmiyahu, the prophet, here has a Kinot over a king. We saw in the Midrash a tense relationship between Yirmiyahu and a king based on the story of Yirmiyahu Lamed Vav. Here, Yirmiyahu mourns a king, and I would say part of what he's mourning is the potential of what could have been with King Yoshiyahu, the righteous King Yoshiyahu. Eichayli konenu melav, ben shmoneh shana, hecheli drosh melav. He was 8 years old when he became king, and part of what's impressive is at 8, he already was Doresh God. He was a kid, but he was an unusual kid, Yoshiyahu, and he turned to God, and he was Doresh God. Rav Soloveitchik compares it to the Midrashim about Avram. He turned on his own, because we know a lot of the kings, their parents, right? The story of the book of Kings is good king, bad king, good king, bad king. And Yoshiyahu didn't have ancestors that showed him the way. He found God on his own. Here's an allusion to Egypt. The story is that Egypt wanted to pass through the land of Israel, and Yoshiyahu didn't want to allow it. Now it's describing his greatness. He was so special, he was greater. Nobody was ever like him since the days of Avigdor. Avigdor is an allusion to Moshe, right? You could see that in the footnote. It's based on Midrash. Amazing. There's nobody like Yoshiyahu since Moshe. Amazing. There were some amazing kings and people and other people between Moshe and Yoshiyahu, but apparently that's how special he was. And I would argue that's part of the potential they're trying to accent of what could have been then. It's an allusion to the clowns of the generation, meaning those who were ruining the generation in idolatry. Ve'yigdol avon ve'shiv yamin achor v'od lashalach yado min achor zaku amarav kenam dat lakim. So he stood up for dat lakim, to establish true religion despite the idolaters of his generation. Bitzam rato barur asher lo yakim. There's an allusion to the fact that he felt at the end that he didn't fulfill the Torah. There's an allusion to a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud that Yoshiyahu did not, and by the way, this is an amazing thing in these Midrashim of Kalir, in the poetry of the Kalir, he's alluding to Midrashim. Avigdor is the name for Moses. That's based on Midrash. Asher Arur Shalakim is an allusion to Jerusalem Talmud passage, which says that Yoshiyahu felt at the end guilty because the Torah was not upheld in his day. Even though he was righteous, his generation wasn't. Chashach Torokin Atzu Rechokim Bebetza Moasei Dat V'chukim Tovim Reim Nikru K'shocho Malach Mali V'lach Hayom L'talach Yedei Amaretz Tambim B'malach Tenash B'Bitzi Pnei Pilach Kila Hamonav Lalechad Aram Narayim Laman Lo Tavor Cherev Kol Shehu B'Ephraim. This brings us back to the geopolitical. He did not want to allow Egypt to pass through. They weren't going to attack the land of Israel, but he didn't want to allow them, like today, can you fly over the airspace? He didn't want to allow them, not the airspace, but to pass through to go north to the enemies of Egypt in the north. He should have listened to the Choseh. Choseh is an allusion to the prophet Yirmiyahu. He was close to Yirmiyahu, but Yoshiyahu had his own geopolitical strategy not to allow Egypt to pass, and Yirmiyahu told him otherwise. I'm continuing on page 103, third line. Chazon Antote is an allusion to Yirmiyahu, the visions of the one from Anatot, Yirmiyahu. He didn't listen to Yirmiyahu. Now anamim lechumo lavzov v'losef panav v'savdu al zod suru hidu ad lo shiyah v'yamanu suru mad yisod neshiyah pnei krav kakrav lo talo shiyah v'yoru hayorim lamelech Yoshiyah. So ultimately, he got caught up in the battle, and he got killed in the battle. He got caught up in the battle with Egyptians who he's trying to thwart from stopping from passing through the land. A terrible ending to a righteous person's life. And part of what we mourn on Tisha B'Av is not just the destruction of temple, but also of cities, but also, of course, of those who inhabit it. And even, of course, the individuals, and especially the leaders. Kalim hitu acharav azon matzafihu van mitui nefesh masafifihu ruchs vatafifza mipihu. And according to the tradition, on his dying lips, he recited the following words of Tziduk Hadin: Tzadikhu Adonai ki mariti fihu. That God is righteous, and I have betrayed the words of God. God is the righteous one. So we said on the one hand, the Kinot express anger, exasperation. God, how could you? But on the other hand, they of course also model the response that ultimately Tziduk Hadin, and somebody like Yoshiyahu was so righteous, he saw that ultimately God is right. Tzadikhu Adonai. Sisinov ki kanazam l'shalem shonam ba'avon bitzam tam ketem atov amzu b'fsham v'konen alav kol echa yuam. And according to tradition, Yirmiyahu's kina or Yeshayahu is not just what we read in Chronicles, but also Echa Yuam, which is the fourth chapter of Echa. According to tradition, the fourth chapter of Echa is also focused on the death of the righteous king Yoshiyahu. What could have been? Tam b'mikra echad kos megidol ishto b'moed shnat hashmita kigah hakel le'etot tala esrimu shtayim haros shatot. The 22 is an allusion to the 22 letters we're about to read. Ki saftu lo eicha b'esrimu shtayim otiyot. 22 is the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And we know in the book of Eicha, a lot of the chapters are structured that way based on the Aleph Bet. So chapter 4 also based on the Aleph Bet. Otot kino lebuta mecholi eit ki shachachti mechololi zamoti kilad yali rashati v'nasati v'nutash ohali. Okay, we turn now to, let's move to 109. 109. And this is a kina, again, by the Kalir, but it's playing on the words Eicha. But rather than Eicha, we saw this last night, it vocalizes things differently. So here it vocalizes not Eicha, but Eiko. Eiko. Where is Ko? Ko means thus. Where is the word thus? Because throughout the Torah and Tanakh, we have important thuses that introduce, thus will be the covenant. Where is the thus? God, you promised us thus that there will be a covenantal relationship. So how could you allow us to suffer so and to abandon us?
Eiko mer koras leav befetzach, bevris ben abesarim, ko yelon netzach, veheina tavulu atzamai beretzach, lama Elohim zonach telon netzach, eiko gash kesel yelol ratzosecha, nelcha adko, pitu biedosecha, veheina ta dakru kefelach rayosecha, yashan abcha betzon marisecha. Eko hafta chasakudim nikudim bimshuos, imka yomar yuchashos, veheina ta vikachta irmileat shuos, arima feamecha lamashuos. Eko zamarag mitzri bigano bakodesh, vayefen kova chochos amedus kodesh, veheina ta chalkam achal chodesh, kol heira oyev bakodesh, eko tov keshulach yol avodecha, kol samar shalach am leavdecha. Vinata Yoshu Vogidim Bevesudecha Shagut Sorarecha Bekerev Moadecha Eko Krisus Chadashos Brusos Choamar Kachatzos Laila Bemophaseosos Vinata Luaku Benalehem Lesos Sam Osos Sam Osos Eko Mishmo Moshe Allah Kosamar Linvas by Samula Vehain Ata Niatua Bene Avla Yivada Kimevi Lemala Eko Siach Shishim Osios Akadumos Kosavarachulis, Shim Giborim Domos, Venatas, who redumos, Bisvach, Eitz Kardumos. Eko Pats, Lakov, Veracham, Ktoshecha, Beshu, Vechos Daber, Humar Liktoshecha, Venatat, Sardu, Alir Kochecha, Shilchu, Vaish, Miktoshecha, Eko Kichas, Levim Shlemecha, Kosas, Elohem, Taram, Vesolamecha, Vehenata, Rashu, Virshu, Shamecha, La'arts Chililu, Mishkan Shemecha, Eko Shivas, Shofros Aretz. Eretz kosas sheshes yamim lapil chomal aretz vinata shiarim tavu va'aretz sarfu chomade el ba'aretz eko teshuas asamay otzar v'cho amar asher ledoros natzar v'hein ata tubchu faraychai b'chatzar ad masay Elohim yicharef tzar.
Let's turn to page 123. And I'll just sit over here for 1 second, and we'll see how our emotional register moves around today. And there's midrash on the word eicha, that the word eicha itself can mean different things. It can mean eulogy or lament, and it could mean sort of questioning. How could it be? So the one we just read was talking about, God, where's the covenant, and how have you not fulfilled the covenant? But now in 123, it's a very different tone, and this is the same Kalir, the same great religious poet who writes these poems. And here the thrust of the message is, God, you are just, you are right, and we have a lot to bury our faces because we haven't lived up to our part of the deal. 123.
Lechot nayatstako bosos asher hiflesa meyaz ve'adochta v'lenu boses haponim mivchina asher nitzrafnu v'osanu tiavta Lechot nayatstako b'goy mikarav goy lokachta b'mosos v'lenu boses haponim dofi asher nimtza v'anu k'masehem asos Lechot nayatstako b'halach Elohim lifto slowly on v'lenu boses haponim v'yamru al yam b'yam suf goy b'loha b'fosham Lechot nayatstako b'zecher v'atamei daivan Elohim v'lenu boses haponim v'charfinu b'sin Kumasei lo nu Elohim Lechot nayatstako b'tam shehi tam tanu b'kitzap yichis b'devos V'lenu boses haponim b'yom hikrafnu lefonov soles v'shemenu devos Lechot nayatstako b'chilkul manu v'er v'abudonon V'lenu boses haponim b'lechem hakol haklo kelavosinu b'alehem b'ragnon Lechot nayatstako b'bar lo chasaru davar V'lenu boses haponim b'natsos lavan v'chatzos v'dizahav kimidu bahar Lechot nayatstako b'suchan vok v'chol malchech noan V'lenu boses haponim b'achar asher mal b'cherem bli mitzo mo'an Lechot nayatstako b'fal asher palta barbasar moshim V'lenu boses haponim etzel micha kivo anachnu poshim Lechot nayatstako b'kimas shilov v'nova v'givon v'esolamim V'lenu boses haponim b'rasha shenimtza v'anu shechar v'uvam אנו נכלמים, לכו אדוני הצדוק, בשני חברוס חרשו בבצענו, ואנו קיימים, ואנו בושס הפונים בשובנו אליך בכל לב, שתשוב אלינו ברחמים, לכו אדוני הצדוק בסיסה, מיוס שניו שעשה שנאה כבושה, מהליכי שחמה, ולנו בושס הפונים כזבל איש חמודוס ושיבה, חטא אלוהי אוזנך שמה.
So if you think about the Kalirs in the 7th century and the land of Israel, and in the 7th century, of course, this is after, it's hundreds of years after what happened, the crushing of the first revolt in the 1st century, the crushing of the second revolt in the 2nd century, and Jewish life somehow finds ways to persist, but as a minority under Byzantine rule and by the he's getting close to the period of the Islamic conquest, so it moves from the Byzantines to afterwards to the Muslims. And amazingly, somehow there are still some Jewish voice in the land of Israel and producing religious poetry, midrashim. These are small numbers of people, the Yerushalmi, and there's somehow, that's the strategy of Jewish survival, to focus on the strengths that do exist, the strengths of the heart, of the mind, of the soul, and to find ways to formulate a religious message for the present, for the future, but building on the past. And one of the things that is amazing is how the intense mourning that's going on in the land of Israel in the 7th century. This is the first time that we hear about 3 weeks. It's in the Israel in the 6th, 7th century, 5th, 6th, 7th century, that we hear about 3 weeks. They realize as much as they find ways to have a Jewish life, they're still under Byzantine rule, they're going to be under Muslim rule, and they have memories of what was. And the Kalir, what we just read, is he's not even thinking about the first temple, or the second temple. He's not even thinking about the first temple, he's thinking about the Bible. In other words, all of time gets blurred somehow. All the messages, the seeds of the Jewish story are in the biblical tradition, and from there through Jewish history up to his time. Now we fast forward to a medieval time, page 125, just skipping a page, and we get to a very, very famous Kinot, which we know also the story of the 10 martyrs, which we know in a different version from Yom Kippur. We read this as a rare shared prayer for Yom Kippur and for Tisha B'Av, 2 very different kinds of fast days. One, a day of slicha, a day of forgiveness, repentance and forgiveness, and Tisha B'Av, primarily a day of mourning. And on both, we invoke Jewish tragedies of rabbinic times, the loss especially of luminaries. And the midrash here, the poem covers, we see this is a 12th century, attributed to one of the Tosafists. So we're in the Ashkenazic world, Germany, France, and describing, though, they're not describing the tragedies of their time here. They're describing Kalir, 6th century, talking about the Bible. Here, 12th century, talking about what happened in the 1st, 2nd century, because all of Jewish time is merged and blurred. All of it is part of what forms us. Let's follow on page 125.
Azay halavono nadire hatara, bales risen commissioner v'gemara, giborei koach, amaleh habitara, damam nishbach, v'nashisa gevura, hinam kedoshe haruge malchus asara, v'yalela nibochia v'eni nigra, zos b'zochri ezach b'mara, Chem das Yisrael klei HaKodesh, Nezeri Torah, Torah leir kedoshim, Esu b'misach amura, Yadu gorol mirishon, Lachei rebera, Kinfol gorol al Rabban Shimon, Pashat savaro v'cho, Kindigzera gezera, Rabban Shimon, Chazal hasal hargo, B'nefesh nitzura, Mizeraron Shuava Kashalabkos, Albain Hagaviro, Notaro Shon Sanoal, Arkubosov, Minora Hatara, Samenov Alenov, Fiv al Piv, Yava Gemura, Onov Yomar, Pe Hamiskaber Batara, Pitom Niksa, Allah Misa, Mishuna Vechamura, Zivol Havshides Rocho Besar, Haskira. Amrul Nafshek Shechi V'Na'avara Rasha HaPoshet Eis Higialim Kom Tefillin Mitzvahs Bora Tza'ak Tza'aka V'Nizvaz Vaza Olam V'Eretz Hispora Me'acharav Heviu Es Rabbi Akiva Oker Harim V'Tochanan Zo B'Zo B'Sivara V'sarku es b'saro b'masrek bazel lehish tabra. Yotzason nishmaso b'yachad uval kol amora. Ashrecha Rabbi Akiva gufcha tahar b'chol minei Torah. Ben bava Rabbi Yehuda acharav heviu. B'shivron levi az haran. Erag ben shivim shana b'dei arura. Yoshev Esanis Hayan Akid V'Chasid B'Mlachta L'Mahara Rabbi Chananya Ben Tradon Achara Makil Kilos B'Tzion Shara Yoshev Edaresh V'Sefer Torah Imo V'Kifuhu B'Chavilei Zimara Es Ha'or Hitzisu Bohem Ucharachuhu B'Sefer Torah Sevogin Shel Semer Henichu Al Libo Shelo Yamus Mehera Chasid Rabbi Yeshevov Hasover Haruguhu Am Amura Zraguhu Vishlichu Lakalavim Velo Hokbar Bekfura Yotzesa Bas Kololov Shelo Hinekulu Mitaras Moshe Lishamra V'Acharav Rabbi Chutz B'Yom Evra Of Hapareach Nisraf Haval Piv Kivimidura Tzadik Rabbi Eliezer Ben Shamua Bachrona Neherag B'Mad Kira Yom Erev Shabbos Hayazman Kiddush V'Kadesh V'Yikra Cherev Shofu Alav Lo Hinichu Bochayim Legamra Yotzesan Ishmaso B'Vara Lahim Yotzer V'Tzor Tzura Kohena v'Kohena Hosifu B'nei Avla Lanos B'Gara V'Schilos Reifa Hereg V'Cheneg Miyuchal L'Sha'ara Noseres Mimena Yochlu Ha'eroseh B'Zura Chazei Hatunafa V'Sho Katuruma Torfu Aryeh V'Hakfira Yetiv Adonai V'Lo Yosif Od Liyasro Ameitz Birkayim Koshlos Chelek Yaakov Moshe Beisara Letzedek Yimloch Melech Yomar Shomu Yemei Evlech Lioro Nisav Gele.
Turn on to the next page, on page 127. I think from what I was able to gather, they think this is the same medieval Tosaphist who wrote this, but now he's focused on tragedies, terrible tragedies of his own lifetime, based on the Crusades and the destruction of the Jewish communities in Germany. This is in the First Crusades, I believe, in 1096, and describing the harrowing scenes of even of suicide and of mass suicide, to not be subjected to the forced conversions of the Crusaders. On page 127.
החריש ממני ודברה ויעבור עלי מו חמאס אזעק ושוד לך שכן שמיימה הציקסני רוחי ולא אכל את דומיה כיולדה אפוא אשף ויסומה מספד מר אסה וכונן בנהימה Divrei Shagosai Yitchu Kayama Sifti Aladasi Ashetnu Lishama Arid Bisichi Vaima V'kol Nehi Arima Eich Shavas Masos V'yarvas Simcha Kol Panim Parur V'chol Rosh Karcha V'chol Zakon Grua V'yakol Lev Anacha Me'oz Nisorer Gayaz Korei Shucha Sila Abirai Hogei Oz Miftecha B'sulosai Uvachurai Nosach Ben Sicha Barosh Kol Chutzos Nivlasam Kasucha Olalai V'tapai Nechzevu Ketzon Tivcha Alila Alzos Fidemasi Alecha Heyasfu Elai V'divu Yetzon Nidecha Liarbos Habachi Ulaharim Hatzvacha Helilu Shamayim V'zaki Yadama Rid B'sichi Vaima V'kol Nihi Arima Erelim Tziu V'tzakum Ara Safo Tamrur Heaguda Bachura Kol Kechola Tzara Kevav Kira Yisonenu Alada Sepsura Alemo Kinigzara Gezera Bacharia Vizam Viavra Vinisvadu Befrishus Vatara Lakade Shem Hagadol Vianara Vish Esachiv Chizchu Biazra Lidavek Biratara Blilikro Alavodazara Vlochasu Al Gever Ugvira Abonim Tzafira Stifara Aval Oru Azrug Vura Yisera Lalom Rosh Vilkrot Shizra Vielamo Dibru Bamira Lozachinu Legadelchem Litara Nakrivchem Kiola Vyaktara Viniske Imachem Liara Hatzfuna Mein Kol Yaluma Arid Bisichi Va'ima V'kolni Arima Az Hiskimu Gedolim Ukatanim Lekabel Biavadin Shochen Yorin Uzakenim Deshenim Rananim Heim Hayut Chilonidonim Vyatsu Likrasam Azefanim V'nergu Hamonim Hamonim V'nisarvu Pedarim Im Pashtonim V'havos Asher Hayu Rachamanim Nefchu Liachzor Kayenim V'esifu Alavos V'albonim Umi Shegarol Olala Rishonim Hunishchat B'chalafos V'sakinim Uvachurim Alei Sola Emunim Heim Lochachu Afor Kedaninim Vakalos Levushos Shanim Meulafos Biozaros Chasanim Minutachos Becherev Chidonim Zichruzos Kihal Adas Nevonim Vial Techashu Mearbos Kinim Vaspidu Ala Chasidim Vahagunim Asher Tzolalu Bamayim Hazedonim Lezecher Zos Nafshi Aguma Arid Bisichi Vaima V'kol Nihi Yarima Torah Torah Chigrisak Vispalshi Bafarim Evel Yochid Asilach Mispei Tamruim Al Tovsei Mishtayich Uforsei Michmorim Malachayich V'chovlayich B'mayim Adirim Orvei Maravech Miashrei Hadurim Mefanchei Tzefunayich Umegalei Michtorim Mikte Begvahos Miasateis Beharim Mifarei Kavayos Miasareis Shvarim Mi Yaflin Ziros Miaroch Nedarim Mishaded Mama Kiach V'chatu Ikarim Umilchom Milchamtech Lasharim Klei Milchama Avadu V'naflu Gibarim Ashreihem Maskilim Karakia Zoharim Bimnuchos Shalom Nachu Yisharim Oy V'yavai Sod V'shever Lanosarim Limdivas Nefesh V'chavalim V'tzirim L'chilyon Einayim Tzamaves V'losudarim Erev omrim mitain tzvarim, uvoker mitzapim migale orim, mimare inimo asher himosarim, michutz shikla acheravim amechadorim, ad masai tatroe kol sitarim, kanei letaroscha asher bazu narim, kila uha fara uha kara uha ligzarim, kisirim sivuchim kidulu hamadurim, ha'al eile tisapak adon kol yitzurim, tinkom dam hanishpach kamayim hamugarim, mishod aniyim meyankas siurim, am shavei fesha liunim umerurim, kuma vinasei altzarim hatzorim, pamecha lamasuo sarima, arid b'sichei va'ima v'kol nihi yarima.
Turn to the next page, but while I'm walking, just one of the lines we just read there is Torah, Torah, chigrisak. A very harrowing image that the Torah itself should wear sackcloth, should dress like a mourner. And we look at our Aron, the Torah is mourning. That's why we don't have the parochet, we don't have the curtain. The Torah itself is mourning, and part of what we do today when we withdraw from certain parts of Torah is because the Torah itself, as it were, is shattered, is in mourning, is not in a state to be fully studied in its ordinary fashion. We turn to page 129, and this is, I think, this shifts back to a rabbinic story, a story from the Talmud and Gittin, if anybody's been doing Daf Yomi, of a story of Rabbi Shmuel's two children who were beautiful children who were split apart, and each one taken as captive, and a heart-wrenching story that they each were forced to marry another captive against their will, coerced. And in the story, ultimately, in daylight, after a long night of crying, they discover that they're with one another, and they tragically die, but die at least united together and not forced to be defiled. A piyut on a Kinot on 129.
Ves navi chatasi hishmima v'dimatzi al lechi azrima ubiyom ze nehi v'niya arima. Evele v'nichum chadal chadol mikol kahev tziri nivdal badol al bein ubas Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol zichra yikod bilvavi asima. Eis nishbo v'naflu l'shnei adonim v'hem shchenim ze l'umos ze chonim v'yesafru ze laze inyanim ze amar mishivyas tzionim shavisi shivcha levush shas shanim kalvana beziv ukilaster panim uveoser kiksia v'mima Re'ehu sefer lo b'chiv layim bani ba mishvi Yerushalayim shavisi eved yifes einayim kashemesh b'tzak fo es tzarayim v'sahar es zamana hishlima bo une zav game v'nachalka benosayim biv lados kamo chochve shamayim l'shema zos titzalna aznayim l'zecher zos es madai afrima kihis kimu al zos shenehem yachad le'erev ziv gum b'cheder echad v'ha'adonim mibachutz libam ke'echad v'hem bochim kemar nefesh v'fachad ad boker b'chiyasam lo hidmima ze yispor b'chil Levav Yimsev Nin Aaron Ech Shivcha Yehi Nosei Vihi Gam Hi Tiel Leil Bisig Ras Shose Bas Yocheved Ech Leeved Tinase Oy Ki Zos Gazar Omer Veose Lazos Yivchu Ash Kisil Vchima Or Boker Ze et Ze Kihikiru Hoi Ach V'Hoi Achos Higbiru V'Nis Chabchu Yachad V'Nis Chavaru Ad Yatsa Nishmasam B'Nishima Lazos Yakonen Yirmiyahu Bishia Gezerah Zos Anid Tamid Belchia Uvil Vavi Yekad Yakod Uchavia Albain Ubas Mispar Rav Ar Ima Vahima Miyamim Yamima Arid Bisiche Vahima Bechol Nehi Arima.
If you notice, just in the very last line, it says, Lezot Yikonen Yirmiyahu B'Shiyah, we just read on page 130. It says, for this is what Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, mourned. But again, this is very odd because it's a story about Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol who lived centuries after Yirmiyahu. But according to what we studied together today, we get the idea that part of Yirmiyahu's mourning was not just about things he witnessed, but things he saw were in the future. And he mourned for things in the future. And here too, I think it fits with the thesis. Here's the children of Rabbi Shmuel, the boy and the girl who died, never got married, never lived out their lives. And that's part of what we mourn, the potential, all the youth that were tragically killed throughout Jewish history and the Holocaust. What's the numbers? A million or so? Over 1 million. Is that what he said? Yeah, about 1 million children. Or a little bit more, whatever the exact figure. It's a shocking, shocking figure. You can't even begin to wrap your mind around that figure. And we mourn of what could have been. What could have been. So here's a midrash of Yirmiyahu mourning about 2 children of a great sage, but in their mourning we mourn over all the children who were lost, including the 1 million plus who were lost in the Shoah and the Holocaust. Okay, we turn now to page 132. 132. And this takes us back to a famous midrash, again, invoking Yirmiyahu, but to talk about medieval tragedies of the Crusades, the destruction of Jewish communities, of what's known as Shum, Speyer, Worms, Megenza. Let's read together, and we'll see it in the Kinot. Miten Roshi Mayim Ve'ini Mekor Nozlayim on page 132, a verse from Yirmiyahu. If I were filled with tears, v'efke kol yomotai v'lo leilai, all day, all night, I would be crying. Chalalei tapai v'olalai, for the children, I'd be crying for the children. V'shishei kalai, and also for the elders. V'atem einu oy v'avoy v'alalai u'b'chu bechera v'heref. And everybody together, Al Beit Yisrael v'alam Adonai kinaflu b'charef. V'tamo atid ma'eni v'elcha liste bochim v'avakei mi merai levav hanevuchim al betulot hayafot v'yiladim harakim b'sifreihem nikrachim v'latevach nimshachim. A terrible graphic image wrapped in their the children who were killed, wrapped up in their books. Dedicated to Torah. Admu etzem mipninim saprim v'napachim kmotit chutzot nidashim v'nishtachim suru tameh karu lamo milikarev al Beit Yisrael v'alam Adonai kinaflu b'charev v'tered eini dima v'lelivanu da v'livki v'lachor sa kekra laspida mepazi karam v'zahav chamuda kvuda pnima Kvod kol klei chemda, ritia krua shichula v'galmuda, haTorah, v'amikra, v'mishnah, v'agada, enu v'konanu zot l'hagida, ei Torah, v'talmid v'halomda, halomakom ein yosef charev. These were the great these were the great yeshivas of Germany. This is the world of Rashi, of Tosfos, the great flourishing of Ashkenazic Jewry, and the Crusades tragically destroyed these communities and these Batei Midrashim. On page 133, Vakonen mar al haruge Ashpira. Ashpira is Spire. I don't know how many have been. I went to visit all these places, these great Jewish centers. There's small centers there in Germany on the Rhine. So Speyer, and we know the date. B'Sheni, B'Shmona Bo, right? We have it right there. It happened on the 8th in the second month, meaning it happened in Sivan, right? This did not happen on Tisha B'Av. It happened on the second month, on the 8th day of Sivan, near Shavuos. Biyom Margoa Hukara, Margoa Eligay Nechlefula Avira, Nergu Bachrei Chemed V'Shishe Hadara, Nesfu Yachad Nafsham, Hishlimu B'Mara Al Yichud Shem HaMiyuchad, Yichadu B'Gvura. It's talking about their great belief, their great faith, that they died on Kiddush Hashem, on martyrdom, rather than being forced to convert in the Crusades. The Crusaders were marching towards Jerusalem, and on the way they were trying to convert those who betrayed their Christian faith in their eyes, forcing them to the lives on their lines. And in their great faith, these holy Jews from Speyer died on Kiddush Hashem. Giborei Koach, Osed Dvaro L'Ma'arav, V'Chonei V'Alamai Nikvu, Kulam Asara, Beit Yisrael V'Alam Adonai, Ki Naflu B'Charev. I'm in the middle of 133. Uvamar Yigonai V'Atzbi Yilelach B'Ra, Ki Lo D'Kodesh Harikitam B'Yom Zachra, Kal Vermaiza. Now we move from Speyer to neighboring town, Worms. We know Rashi's associated, was born in Worms. So Vermaiza, Bechuna V'Chura, Gonei Eretz Nikiyatara, Pamaim Kichu Shem HaMiuchad B'Mora. And now we have another date, Besrim Shlosha B'Chodesh Ziv L'Tahara, on the date of 23rd of Ziv, which is Iyar. I messed up before. I'm sorry. We're in the month of Iyar, not the month of Shavuot, the month of Iyar. And so the 23rd of Chodesh Shishi, and now we get to the third month, which is the month of Shavuos. B'kriyat Halel l'shorerai shlimu nafsham ba'avak shura, imima aleim b'chiyel al ashra, kulei cheter al risham latara. Altogether, al Beit Yisrael v'alam Adonai, ki neflu b'charev. And now we turn to the third town, right? We've done Speyer and Worms. The third is Megenza. That's why they're called Shum, Shin, Vav, Mem. Speyer, Worms, and now Megenza. All three were destroyed. These small but precious, holy Jewish community centers of Ashkenazic Torah. Direi kal Megenza hadura, misharim kalu mariolat gabra, shlimu nafsham al yichud shem hanora. That again is total dedication. Yichud shem is kiddush Hashem, saying Shema, dying in their faith. V'aleim zakat shever ezak v'nefesh mara, al shnei migdashai yisodam kayom arura, v'al charvod ma'ad migdashei midrashei Torah. It's comparing the destruction of these communities to the destruction of the temple. Altogether, al Beit Yisrael v'alam Adonai, ki naflu b'charev. Bottom of page 133. B'chodesh hashlishi b'shlishi. And now we're talking about right near Shavuos, and we'll see an allusion to Shavuos. This is when these destructions happen. Now we're talking about a Megenza in Mainz. No safle da'avonu meira hachodesh asher nehepach liagon v'tzara. It was turned from happiness to tzara. B'yom matandat, the day of Shavuot, sibarti lahait ashra. It should have been joyous. Uv'yom netinatan kmo chen az chazra. When the Torah is given, so it was taken away in Mainz through this tragedy. Al talal marom lamakom medura. We saw before the Torah wearing a sack. Here the Torah was given and now it's taken back up to heaven. 134. Simuna levavchem misped mar lekashra kishkula ragitam lehitabel litapra kushrefat beit Eloheinu olam ve'bira. The destruction of centers of Ashkenazic Jewry is like destruction of a Beit HaMikdash. That's the power of Torah being concentrated in great centers in Europe. V'chi ein lahosif moed shever v'teira tavera ve'ein lagdim zulati lachara tachat ken hayom livyati hara v'spida ve'lila ve'evke b'nefesh mara v'anchati kaved miboker v'ad arev. That passage, these passages right now are explaining, if we know the dates, and they happened in Tammuz, in the second month after Pesach, and Sivan, around Shavuos time, why don't we mourn these days then? But these passages right now, the Mekonen is answering, because all of these are concentrated in our mourning today, because in Jewish history, we see things as we have a panoramic view, and all of our tragedies, as terrible as they are all threaded through in a common trajectory. And on Tisha B'Av, it's the time where we mourn over not just the Beit HaMikdash, and not just Bar Kochva, but also we go back to the tabernacle, to Shiloh, and we go forward to tragedies, including tragedies of the Crusades, all the way through tragedies of the 20th century. I'm in the middle of 134. I call out to the lamenters. Can one even compare to these pain that we suffer? Michutz tishakel cherev b'chadarim emot chalalei chalalei cherev mutalim arumim v'arumot nivlatam kesucha l'chayat eretz v'libimot yonek imish seva alamim v'alemot al beit Yisrael v'alam Adonai ki naflu b'charev. The second half here on 134. Natatim b'mamon marbim klimot Eloheim amru tzur chasayu bo'ad yimimot yavo v'yoshia v'yachzir neshamot chasin yam michamocha naseh lumot תחשב ותתאפק ולא תחקור חמות באמור אלי מליגאים אלוהים הוא ירב על בית ישראל ועל אדוני ינבא בחר. Call out to God to return the souls, restore the souls. איני יורדמיים כנפח לבל משורר וגבי לכל בוכים מלאפק ולקרר מי אין נוד לי ואין מחזיק להתעורר חיימה בי יצא ושר מתגורר אכלני הממני עצר הצורר שיבר עצמותי זורר ומפרר סילה כל הבירה הטבור והשורר רטויי מזורר אין לזורר מכתי אנושה בין מטיל מזורר כן אמרתי שהוא מני אמרר בפחי דמעתי על החיה לצרב על בית ישראל V'alam Adonai ki naflu b'charev. Okay, we turn now to page 130, the next page. And there's a very powerful midrash. It's that's being alluded to here. It was back to the Kaliyah, an earlier lamenter, but it's on page 135. We're not turning back in the book. And it's Yirmiyahu visiting the ancestors. And Yirmiyahu saying, ancestors, how are you sleeping? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, patriarchs, matriarchs, how are you sleeping when your children are suffering and on the verge of destruction? So wake up and plead on their behalf, intercede on their behalf. And in this version, he finally turns to the matriarchs, but there's a more famous version of the Midrash that ultimately it's Rachel, Rachel, who stirs God to have mercy. Let's join Rabbi Einsiler on page 135.
Oz bahaloch Yirmiyahu el kivrei avos, v'nom atzamos chabivos, ma'atem shochavos, v'neichem galu, v'teichem charivos, v'yezuchus avos, b'yeres motal uvos, go chulam bikinim al chesron banim, dovavu b'kol tachanunim, p'nishochem mero omonim, v'yeh haftachas, v'zacharti lhem b'ris lishonim, heim ahemiru chavodi b'sohu, v'lopochadu v'lorohu, v'alim einai mehem, v'lo noho, v'lo shoho, v'yeches apak al amiras lohu, Zoak Ab Hamon Ba'aburam, Bichinim Pnei El Ram, Chinam Nuseisi Eser Bichinos Aburam, Behain Chazisi Shivram, Bayehab Tochas, Alti Rabram, Tol Horos Babudos Zoros, Yatzulach Tzok Boros Nishbaros, Veches Apak Al Bitul Asaras Hadivros, Ko Tzavach Yitzchak, Peneshochim Bishochak, Lashov Bi Tebach Huchak, והן זרי נשחק ונמחק, ויהיה הבטחס, יש בריסיה כמס יצחק, מורו בירמיהו בצימו הר המוריה, ולעשי נשאות גיאיה, או ללי מנשיה, ויחס הפק בהריגת זכריה, סוך יולד בסלף, דמאוס כסנין זולף, עוללי שטיפחתי באלף, איך גוזו מני בחולף, ואיך הופרה מני דמים בדמים. כמו אלף, פוצרו עד נאמן כפוש באפר מודמן, צאן אשר בחיקי האמן, ואיך גוזו בלא זמן, ויהיה הבטחס, כי לא אלמן, כל בכי לאו מסופפס על לבביה. רחל אחוסו מבקו על בניה, זלפה מכה פניה, בלתה מקוננת בשתי ידיה, שובי סמימים למנו חסכם, מלא מלא כל משאלו שכתיכם, שולחתי בובל למענכם, הנני בשובב גולוס ביניכם.
Okay, we turn now to page 144, and here we need to tap into one of our talents to lead us in a special recitation. So please join, and the way we'll do it is one verses, we'll sing verse by verse, we'll follow along.
Eshtukad bikirbi bahalosi alibi bitesi mimitrahayim kinima ira lema naskira bitesi mirushalayim az. Az yashir Moshe, ashir lo yinashe, b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim, vaykonen Yirmiyav, v'nahan nehiniya, b'tzeisi mirushalayim, beisi hiskonan, v'shachan he'anan, b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim, v'chamas el shachna, alai kanana, b'tzeisi mirushalayim, Galeyam hamu v'chachoma kamu b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim Zidonim shatafu v'al roshi tzafu b'tzeisi mirushalayim Digan shamayim v'tzur yazuv mayim b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim La'anav samrurim umayim hamorim b'tzeisi mirushalayim Hashke v'ha'arev svivos har chorev b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim Korei el evel al naharos bavel b'tzeisi mirushalayim Umarei kvod Adonai kirshocheles lefanai b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim V'cherev letusha letevach netusha b'tzeisi mirushalayim Zevach u'mincha v'shemen hamishcha Segula selekucha katzon lativcha b'tzeisi mirushalayim Chagim b'shabasos u'mosim v'yosos b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim Tanis v'evel urdo fahevel Mirushalayim tovu ohalim li arba'a digalim b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim ahale yishmelim u'machanos arelim b'tzeisi mirushalayim yovel u'shmita v'eret shoketa b'tzeisi machor litzmisus v'charos l'chrisus Kapodes v'yaron v'yavnei zikaron Mimitzrahayim v'yavnei hakala uchelei habala b'tzeisi mirushalayim Leviyim v'yahronim v'shivim uzkenim b'tzeisi mimitzrahayim Nogesim umonim umochrim v'konim Mirushalayim Moshe yir'enu v'aharon yanchenu Nebuchadnezzar Tifsar Adrianus Caesar B'Tzeisim Yerushalayim Na'aroch Milchama Adonai Shama B'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Rachak Mimenu V'Hinei Enenu B'Tzeisim Yerushalayim Zisrei Faroches V'Sidrei Ma'aroches B'Tzeisim Mitzrayim Chema Nitaches V'Alai Sochaches Olos uzvachim v'ishei nichochim Bechutzos medukarim b'nei Tzion haikarim Pa'arei migbaos lechavod nikbaos Shrikos usruos v'kolos uzvaos Tzitz hazahav v'hamshel v'rahav Hushlach hanezer v'afas ha'ezer Kedusha ugvura uchvod Adonai nira Nigala umora v'ruach hatuma Rina v'yishua v'chatos ros hatrua Zakas olal v'na'akas chalal b'tzeisim Yerushalayim shulchanu menorah v'chalil uktorah Elil v'soeva ufesel matzeva b'tzeisim Yerushalayim Torah usuda v'seder ha'avoda b'tzeisim Mitzrayim sason v'simcha v'nasyagon v'anacha b'shuvi l'Yerushalayim.
Shkoyach, we turn now to page 150. And now we have a different Mekonain. The Mekonain is none other than Yehuda Halevi, the great Jewish philosopher of Spain, of the north of Spain. And Yehuda Halevi, who's most famous for writing the book The Kuzari, the great work of Jewish thought. The dialogue defending Jewish tradition against other religions and who detracted, and talking about the principles of Judaism. But he's also well known as a poet, and he wrote some beautiful poetry and some, both uplifting but also heart-wrenching poetry. And here we'll read two poems of his, one on 150, and then the more famous one that we'll turn to next. And the one on 150 speaks about a rabbinic tradition, which is focused on the death of an individual, the individual being Zechariah. Zechariah, who was, according to rabbinic tradition, both a Navi and a Kohen Gadol. He was both. And there's a line in that we read, Im Yareg b'migdash Hashem Kohen v'Navi. The greatest tragedy one could, it's hard to wrap one head around it, but imagine if somebody is both the priest and the prophet, and that person to be killed. And that's the story of Zechariah, and his blood, according to the legend, was boiling, and until it was avenged by the Babylonians. God sent punishment for this terrible tragedy. There's a whole rabbinic legend, and it's alluded to on page 150 in the poem by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi.
Yo mach bi ich quadati vich plu of noi beshalchi yar bedam navi bchatsar el mikdash adonai vloki sas hu adamar bocher of monai vlo shakat adehu kam dam hanavi Zechariah Haya holech v'soer ad borav tabachim uval mikdash adonai matzadim roschim vayishal v'avor zeh lakonim hazovchim vayanuhu ki zehu dam karban hazvachim vayinaseh bedam parim v'dam elim v'dam emichim v'gam zavchu zevach rov l'chakor mehayon ובכל זאת לא שוקט ועודו קיים נגרש, וביקש שבר וימצא מפורש, כי הוא דם איש האלוהים על לא חמאס שורש. ויאמר נבוזראדן גם דמו הנה נדרש, יספו לי הכהנים והוציאו מבית אדוני, ומבית כי לא אשקוט עדי ישקוט דם הנביא זכריה. דקר ישישים למאוס ואחרים לריבוס, וירד לטבח כהני אדוני צבוס, ונשקט לדם הנביא והיו למופס לוס, והבנים נשחטים בני אבוס רוס, ומוסם לטבח גם אחריהם בוס, ואמר לנפשי זה חטוסך וזה פריו. הוסיף להרוג נשים יומקי שדיים, ודם עולה ביניהם קדם יור מצרים, עד אשר נשא נבוזראדן ליבו לשמיים, ויאמר האין די בבנות ירושלים, אך לא אתה עושה שירת השוויון. לכך אתנו אלוהים אבינו וירשנו והרגנו ביחד וירשנו ידענו, יחסכו לנחמנו כמשול שיבנו מפרי מעלינו זה כמה סבנו, רחם לרוחם הסור עניה, עינה לך תישא וסס רסך צופיה.
Getting now to our final stretch of Kinot on 152. It's the most famous of the Yehuda Halevi Kinot, Tzion Halo Tishali, which of course is also turned into a song that sometimes we sing. And this is part of the Kinot, which are known as the Tzion Kinot, page 152. And they talk about Tzion, which is what's on our mind today, Zion. And the word Tzion can mean different things. It can mean the city. It can mean the temple. It can mean Jerusalem. And all those meanings are on our mind. And some of them we have the great privilege of. Last night I was sent by Laura Rabinowitz. She sent me a beautiful kumzitz scene from Tzion, from the Kotel. Despite all the tumult that's going on in the land of Israel, a beautiful kumzitz scene of Jews coming together to sing, to pour out their hearts on Tisha B'Av. And there's a long tradition of pouring out your heart for Tzion. And who did this more than Yehuda Halevi, who famously talked about, wherever I am, I know where my heart is. And my heart is in Zion. And my heart is with the center of our people. And if that was true at times where Tzion was more an imaginary idea, it was always a place, but there was very little Jewish life. Can we imagine now how much our hearts need to be with Zion? So we follow along. We are only going to read one Kinah of the Tzion Kinahs, but there are a bunch of them, and they capture our longing and also what was and also what not just could have been, but what will be, please God. 192.
Tzion, halosi shali l'shlom asiroyach, darshei shlomech v'hem yeser adoroyach, v'yam u'mizrach v'tzafon v'seiman, shlom rachok v'karov, se'i mikol avoroyach, v'shlom asir tikva nosein demo'av, ketal chermon, v'nichsaf l'riditam al hararoyach, l'vkos enusech and isanim, v'esech alom shiva shivusech, ani kinar l'shirayach. Libi leveisel, l'fniel ma'od, yehemeh u'lamachanayim v'chopigeit harayach. Sham hashchina shchein alach, v'hayotzrech pasal lemul sharei shachak she'arayach. Chvod Adonai levad haya ma'orech, v'ein shemesh v'sahar v'chochavim be'rayach. Evchal nafshi l'hishtapech b'makom asher roach Elohim shvucha al b'chirayach. At beis melucha ve'at kisei Adonai. Ve'ech yeshvu avodim alei kisos gevirayach. Mit neni mishotet b'mekomos asher niglu Elohim lechozayach v'tzirayach. Mi yaseh li chanafayim v'archik nidod, agid levisrei levavin bein b'sorayach. Epola pe alei artzech, ve'ertzeh avonoyach ma'od, v'achonein es aforayach. Afki bomdi alei kivros avosai, v'eshtomem b'chevron alei mivchar kvorayach, Avod biarech v'charmilech v'amod b'gladech v'esh tamamela al har avaroyich. Har ha'avarim v'hor ha'hor asher sham shnei arim gedolim b'rayich u'morayich chayei neshamos aver artzech u'mimor doror evkas afarech v'nofet suaf l'harayich. Yin am l'nafshi haloch arom v'yochef alech arvos shmama asher hayu devirayich bimkom aronech asher nignaz v'mikom kerevayich asher shachnu chadrei chadarayich Ogoz v'ashlich be'er nizri v'ekov zman chileel be'eretz t'meya es nizirayich eich ye'arav li achol shusos v'eis echazeh ki yiskavu haklavim es kfirayich O eich v'or yom yehi masok le'enei v'oda rebbe fi arvayim b'kreda sharayich kos hayigonim li'at charpi ba'at ki chavar mal'uch salai v'nafshi mimarayich eis es kara ahla eshte chamarech v'es kara ahaliva v'emse es shemarayich sion kilas yefi ahava v'chein tikshari meyaz uvach nikshiru nafshos chavirayich heim hasmechim l'shalvosech v'akoavim al shamamusech uvochim al shirayich mibor shavi shoafim negdech umishtachavim ish mimkamo elai noach sharayich and rehamonech asher galu his pazru mehal giva lo shachachu gederayich amachazikim b'shulayich umitzaamtzim la'alos v'lechos misani getum rayich Shinar ufas ros hayarchuch b'gdolam v'im chevlam yadamu l'sumayich v'rayich el mi yadamu m'shichayich ve'el mi yadnevayich ve'el mi leviyayich v'sharayich yisgev yachalov kliel kol mam chalos helil chasnech olam l'dor v'dor zerayich yivech l'moshav v'heloyich v'ashrei enosh yivchar v'yikrav yishkom batzerayich Ashrei mechakev yagiav v'yireh alom orech v'yibaku alav sharayich l'ros b'tovas b'chirayich v'alos b'simchasech v'shuvech elai kadmas norayich.
We're getting to our very last few Kinot. We're going to turn to 161, which actually goes back to medieval. And it's the burning of the Talmud in Paris in 1240. Again, it's hard for us to totally relate because now we have, amazing resources, virtual and otherwise, and physical and printing and online. But in those days, in a world of manuscripts to burn, when the church burnt the Talmud and the Jewish books, it was trying to snuff out not just Jewish lives, but the heart and soul of Judaism. And the miracle of all these stories is, despite burning of Talmud, despite destruction of the yeshivot of Ashkenaz, that all, I don't know if all, but the essence of their Torah was transmitted and is as alive as ever today. I asked Rabbi Kahana to lead us here on page 161.
Sha'ali srufa va'esh lishlom avalechia hamitarvim shechom bechatzar zvualecha haso'ofayim ba'afar eret v'hacho'avim hamisho'amayim alei moked gvileiche hochim shechem ve'inoga v'kovim l'or yomam Aleim asher yizrach v'alayach, ulishlom enosh ne'enach, boche belev nishbar, tamid mekonen alei tzirei chavalayach, vayitonen ketanim uvnot yana, vayikra mitzvei mar b'gelalecha, echa netuna va'esh ochla תאכל באש בשר, ולא נקבו זרים בכחלייך. עד אן עדינה תהי סוכנה ברוב השקט. ופני פרחי הלא קצו חרו לייך. תשבי ברוב גאווה לשפוט בני אל בכל המשפטיים. ותביא בחיללך עוד תגזרי לשרוף דעת אש וחוקים. ולכן אשר שישלם לך גמולייך. צורי. בלפיד ואש ועבור זה נתנך. כי באחרייס תלהט אש בשבולך. סיני. הלכם בך בחר אלוהים. ומעצך בגדולם וזרח בגבולייך. להיות למופת לדעת כי תתמעטת ותרד מכבודה, והן אמשול משלייך. משל למלך אשר בכה למשתה בנו. צפה אשר יגבה כן את במילייך. תחת מעיל תתחס ציני לבושת בשק. תעטה לבוש אלמנות. תחליף שמלייך. אוריד דמעות עדי יהיו כנחל. ויגעו לקברות שני צרי אצילייך. ושבי ארון בהור ההר. ואשל היש תורה חדשה. וכן יצרפו גללייך. חודש שלישי בהקשר. הרביעי להשחית חמדתך. ובכל יופי גללייך גדל ללוחות. ועוד שיני בהיוולדו לשרוף באש דת. הזד תשלום כפלייך, את מה לנפשי. ואיך ירב לחיקי אכול אחרי רותי אשר עטפו שלייך. אל תוך רחובה כנידחת, וצרפו שליל עליון, אשר תימת לבוא כהלייך, ולא אדע למצוא דרך צולייך. והיו אבלות נתיב יושר מצלייך. יומתק בפי מדבש, למצוך במשקה דמעות, ולרגלי הליות כבול כבלך, ירב לעיני צהוב ממי דמעי, עדי קילו, לכל מחזיק בכנף מעילייך, אך יחרבו ברדדתם על לחיי עבור, כי אם נחרו רחמי ונלידור בעלייך. לקח צרור כעצבו הלך בדרך, למרחוק ואימו. הלא נצאו צלייך ואני כשחול וגדלמור נשארתי לבד מהם. כתורם בראש הר מגדלייך ולא אשמע עוד לכל שרים ושרות. עלי כי נתקו מיתרי תופי חלייך אלבש ויתכם בשק. כי לי מאוד יקרו עצמו ככל ירביעו נפשות חלייך. את מה מאוד, על מאור היום אשר יזרח אל כל, אבל יחשיש אלי ואלייך. נזעקי בכל מר לצור. על שברונייך ואל חילייך, ולו יזכור אהבת כלואייך. חגרי לבוש שק, עלי הברה אשר יצא לחלק, וצפתה את צולייך. כי מות ענותייך, ינחמך צור, וישיב שבות שבטי ישרום, וירים את שבלייך. אות הרי, ועדי שני, וטוב ציחכי, תלכו במחול וצהלי במאכלייך. ירום לבבי, יבת יאיר לצד צור, ויגעו לשכחך, ויראו אף אלייך.
I'm going to turn now to our towards the very end on page 173. It's always practice to do a Kinot for the Holocaust. In this context, I think of a midrash on Eicha that Rabbi J.J. Schachter cites. The midrash talks about two sages, Rebbe and Rabbi Yochanan. And the Midrash says that on a verse in Eicha, they both dove deep, really delved into the verse. And Rebbe on the verse would teach, when he's learning this verse of Eicha, he would teach 24 different teachings. And Rabbi Yochanan would teach 60 different teachings. Okay, so I know this entire day sometimes requires some patience. It's hard. We're fasting. It's a summer day. It's a long day. At least we're not outside. We're inside. I hope everybody's inside. If you can't be well hydrated, at least be well AC'd if you can. But it's not easy. But we see how the early sages, how they, when they studied Eicha, they didn't just read Eicha and chant it. They tried to study it. But again, the teaching says that Rebbe understood 24 different layers, while Rabbi Yochanan, 60 different layers. So you might think, the Midrash says, you might think that Rabbi Yochanan was a greater sage than Rebbe, because Rabbi Yochanan was able to come up with 60 different layers, while Rebbe was only able to come up with 24. Says the Midrash, that is not the case. Rather, Rebbe lived closer to the Churban. Rebbe lived earlier than Rabbi Yochanan. And when Rebbe would learn Eicha in the shadow of the destruction of the temple, which he knew more familiarly, not directly, but he knew it more intimately because he knew the stories more directly. He would read a verse and start to interpret and break down in tears. And with great strenuous effort, somehow he was able, despite all that, to give 24 different layers of teachings. And Rabbi Yochanan, who is more remote, who's more distant, who's less raw, he was able to keep his composure more. And when he studied Eicha, he was able to teach 60 different layers of teachings. This to me resonates when we think about saying a Kinot for the Holocaust. I think we say one Kinot because even that's a struggle. How do you give words to the Holocaust? How do you give words? How do you have the composure to try to find a elegiac Kinot poem to describe our feelings for the Holocaust? So we have economy of words. When we're talking about Churban Beit HaMikdash, we have many Kinot. And when we talk about the Holocaust, our practice usually is to have one Kinot because we don't even have the words. But we still at least need to make the effort to give some expression to that gaping wound which is in all our hearts. I asked Rabbi Einsider to lead the Kinot on 173 for the Holocaust.
Eicha tifartenu meroshenu nishlachta. Eicha ponecha mimeno histarta. Eicha kotzafta v'locha malta. Belev nishbar nitke b'yom tzon batzara. Bonu lepenecha lispo d'livkos b'kina uvilala. B'zochreinu es kedoshei hashavot totzat tosha. Gon Yaakov ashahav toshibarta. Godato Rome Hakomo Vahagavohim Hishpalta Gafnenu Lishama Usenosenu Likitsafa Samta Dovku Atsomenu Leorenu Ubasarenu Docho di Kisa Loretz Chayenu Dolfo Mituga Vanocho Nafshenu Hane Avim Bahani Imim Bahayishorim Bahatamimim Hut Anu Bakronos Kigabosim Ubakarim Chachom machanach b'hapasochim chasumim, v'osikim yoshevim ala oretz domimim, u'mechoyes lachatosom heim shualim, b'lomo nigzar adin b'li rachamim. זכור תזכור סקס הנובים, זקס היסומים הגלמודים הנעזבים, זלזול חכמים ותלמידיהם האהובים. חיילים ראשי בסבוס גיבורים, חלולים ומדוקרים נפלו מיליונים, חרפו ומשמו חויסו לגויים. טיפחנו וריבינו האחזור קילום בהשימם, טורוף טורפו כזאבים לשפוך דמם, טבח 600 ריבו מזמם. יורדו חיים שאולה בשמע ישראל ואני מאמין, יוצאו נשמותינו וצרים בטליס ותפילין, יבושו ויקולמו ויהיו כעין הרוצחין. כל שירנו ולבבינו על שבח חלקנו, כולם נושאים קינה באובדן חצי עמנו, כי שגולה השבוע כשריפת בית אלוהינו. לאושוויץ, בוכנוולד, ברגן-בלזן, דכו, בדנקן וטרבלינקה, לוכחו והודחקו בחד בגוז ונשרפו בקודוס הכבשונים בחרפה. לחמו הקדושים הטהורים ונפלו כגיבורים בגטו ואשה. מכל פינה זועקים דמיהם הכבושים. מוסה יבוא קץ לפגועים האנושים, מספד מר בקינה שאו על הקדושים. נועצו הנועצים את הבריס וסורסנו, נפלו עלינו מחורפיך, ונבכה בצום נפשנו, נפלו עטרת ראשנו, אוי נו לנחל עשינו. ספרי תורה לגזרים קראו וטמאו בידיהם, סרקו בשר שירנו, ואורם הפכו לקישותיהם, סיפדו וחיגרו שק, והעלילו עליהם בעל טפיהם. איננו זולגוס דם דמאוס, על שריפת בתי כנסיות, על הריסת ישיבות ובתי מדרשות. פורצו גאלוסינו והרסו עדותינו, פחד קראנו ורעדו אחזוסנו. פנינו כיססו כלימה בשרוסינו, צייה ארכו בחסר ובחפון, תנועוס בנפשון שלחו ידן, צעקו בים סוף נשמע קולון. קרובים בידידים חביבים חסידים בישרים, קדושים וטהורים, כזוהרקיע מזהירים, קבלים והסירים, בסייסג רפך לעולמים. רחום, זכור ברחמך, שרידי נחלתך, ריבון העולמים, חוסר דאגו בסוגו מעמך, ושעס הגויים בשונאי ישראל, תעקר בזמך, שבויים הדרר, ופקח כוח לעצורנו, שמן ששון תחת אבל תעטרנו, שלום ושלווה תשים לנו ולצרינו. תורים קרננו ושכיש גאולתנו במהרה בימינו, תגל ערבו וספרך ורצלת ישראל מדונתנו, תבורכנו בברכת אברהם יצחק ויעקב אבותינו.
We all rise just 1 second on page 176. And we end with the singing together of a Litzion, which expresses that we're broken and we're at the end of words. When we got to the Holocaust, we're at the end of words. So we sing one last painful dirge to say that there's more to mourn. The image here is of a Tzion, a young bride, Tzion, a mother on a birthing. So much potential, so much what was lost, but so much what could have been. And I think for us, really, the potential of what we could galvanize from this day, of what we can still do, what is ahead, what can be. Let's sing the song together, Elitzion.
Asher nutash, biash mason adoreha, bial bias michorfel, besach migdash kadoreha, ale galus mishor seel, bi'imei shir zimoreha, bial dama mashe shupa, kimo meimei yoreha, ale hegyon micholeha, Asher damam bi'areha, bi'ad vad asher shomei, uvihitu sanhedreya, Alei Sivchei Semideha, Ufidyonei Bechoreha, Vial Chilu Kilei Hechal, Umizbach Kitoreha, Alei Tafe Melacheha, B'nei David Yevireha, Vial Yofyam Asher Choshach, V'yei Sarur Chisareha, Alei Chavod Asher Gola, V'yei Korban Devireha, Vial Lochitz Asher Lochatz, V'som Sakim Chagoreha, Alei Machatz V'ro Makos, Asher Hukun Ezireha, Vial Niputz Elei Selah, Olo Leha Ne'oreha, Alei Simchas Misaneha, V'sachakam Al Shavareha, Vial Ninui B'nei Chorin, Nidi Beha Tehoreha, Alei Fesha Asher Afsa, Slo Derech Ashureha, Vial Tzivos Kihaleha, Shizufeha Shechoreha, Alei Kelos Mecharfeha, V'eis Kavreha, Vial Megadafeha, V'soch Mishkan Chatzireha, Alei Shimcha Asher Chulal, B'fi Kamei Mitzareha, V'yal Tachan Yeshavula, Kisho Ushma Amoreha, Elei Tzion V'yareha, Kimo Isha B'tzireha, V'chivisulach Agur Asa, Alba Neureha. Ashri Yoshevi Sechol.
Davening on page 180.
Ashri Yoshevi Sechol, Yodel Shem, Olashim, Levit. Rimachalai Melabur, Hashim Chabachol, Yomabur, Hashim Chadola, Dino Mulam, Yoda, Dodor, Shabach, Rusacha, Yomir, Trap to Hosis, Ran, Homer, Kapang, Dod, Hoset, Tomanana, Cover, Hamabami, Dukhadra, Koma, Seva, Yod, Mokot, Malchus, Shout, Mechadon, Honam, Necholach, Sech, Decha, Masbialo, Hyrus, Kadre, Beholder, Hasil, Roba, the Hokla, or Shake, Rasano, Dabe, Breakup, or Social, Kachori, Lamboed. ונח נלבורך יא, מעצב יד עולם, הדלויה, ועולציום גואל. אתה קדוש, אשי תהילת ישראל, בכל הזל זה ויאמר, קדוש, 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 נורא צבאות מלכות צבאות, גם בדם יאמר, קדם בן קדוש, קדם יאמר צבאות, מייל חבר, זיבר ראש מעקב שלו, ברוך הוא מקומו, דעשים שער, בשער, 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 בכין, גם שער מייסים, מלחבים, מלחבים, מעיין, רב, יזו, בסדר, שום, זה למייס, משהו, ברוך הוא מקבל, בלוי, חבי, הבאו שעתו, הרב חסר, יום לא של נאס מסקאפ נאס נאס וייט ברוך הלהם שברן ולכבודו ונתנו סנטור חיה נתח בין YouTube בכל ובדש מריו זאדר שחר אדוני אדוני חביס למעצית כה יגדיל תורה וידיר יסקדל ויסקדש מרבה יום מודי ברוך ירוסי ויום נחמח וסי בחיי חון ויום איכון בחיי רב ביסר בגל הזמן קריבי אמרו אמן יהי שמירה בו מבורך יולם בדמי עולמיה יספרח וישתבח ויספואר ויסרומם ויסנסי ויסהדר ויסהלב ויסהלול שמי קודשה בריחו יהי לא מכל בחסה ושרסה שפסה מנחמסה תמירם ויאמה ויאמרו אמן יהי שלום רב מן שמיה וחיים מלאנו ועלכה ישראל ויאמרו אמן Say shalom barama, we say shalom aleinu v'yalka Yisrael v'imru, amen. Aleinu? No. Aleinu, 184. Aleinu l'shabecha, Adonai, kol seis gudol Yosef b'reis Rosano, because of Torah nach, because of Limodin, if Nimelch Malchi, Amalach, Imod Hashem Shmatinu, Emes Malkeinu, Efes, Rusa, Koso, Sovidat Yom, Vashu, Vashu, Heinu, Los, Meira, Saki, Nam, Chodedi, Boshar, Shebel, Hil, Rabbi Shvach, Koshar. Nema boya melech al kol oretz bayom hu yadonai echad u'shemo echad monis kadosh yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabba yom modi v'roch yirusei v'yom nichmach usei v'chayi yichon v'yom eichon v'chayi d'chol beis Yisrael v'agolo b'zman kori v'yomru amen yisparach v'yishtabach v'yispoar v'yisromam v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisalev v'yisalol shemei t'kudusha v'richu Yilami called the Chassab, Shasat, Chassab, and Hamasa, Miram Yamav, Imbrume, Yehi Shalom Rab Mishmaya v'Chaim Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'Yimru Amen. Say Shalom Ramav v'Yaseh Shalom Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'Yimru Amen.
Shkaya, thank you to all who were here, all who led, all who davened together, all who are at home. Thanks to Regina Gill, our chair of the Park East Synagogue Cinema Society and Gold Coast Arts. We have an afternoon filled with film. One just started, so you can still catch it right now. The conference that just started now at 11, and also at 2:30, those who remain, and at 4, Exodus 91. We will have an early mincha today at 2, and a late mincha at 8, and the conclusion of the fast is 8:51, break fast. You could just dream about it right now. Sponsored by Rabbi Harold Einsider in memory, loving memory of his mother, Helen Einsider. Som Kal, easy.